Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've been holding on to this story for years, and I still get chills thinking about it. This happened back in 1978 when I was living in Queensland. I was 24 at the time, working at a local hardware store and living in one of those new housing developments they were building everywhere back then. I'd been living in the area for about 8 months, and there was this shortcut I'd discovered between my estate and the next one over, where my mate Dave lived. It cut through this really dense bit of bushland, super thick with trees and tall grass. The shortcut was only about 100 meters through, but it saved me a good 30 minutes compared to taking the main roads around. During the day, plenty of people used the track, kids on bikes, people walking dogs, that sort of thing. But at night, different story. Most locals wouldn't go near it after dark. There were all these stories about yowies in the area, Australia's version of Bigfoot if you're not familiar. I'd heard the stories since I moved there, but I always thought they were just tales to scare kids away from wandering in the bush at night. You know how it goes. Every town has those local legends. It was a Friday night in August, middle of winter for us in Australia. I'd finished work late, around 9:30, and was heading to Dave's place for some beers. We'd planned to watch the footy that was being broadcast late. I remember being annoyed because I was running behind and I really didn't want to miss the start of the match. I had this old bicycle, nothing fancy, just a basic Malvern Star that got me around. I remember standing at the entrance of the track, debating whether to take the long way around. The moon was nearly full that night, which gave me a bit more confidence. I could see maybe 15 or 20 feet ahead on the path, which seemed good enough. I figured I'd be through in a couple of minutes anyway. What could happen in that short amount of time? So I made the decision to take the shortcut. The entrance was this narrow gap between some eucalyptus trees, and the path itself was just hard-packed dirt, not much wider than a sidewalk. As soon as I rode in, the temperature seemed to drop. That's normal in densely vegetated areas, but that night it felt different somehow, colder than usual. The air was completely still, which was weird for that time of year. I'd gone maybe 20 feet in when this field rat darted across the path right in front of my front wheel. I nearly lost control of the bike, swerving to avoid hitting it. My heart was already racing from that little scare, but I kept going. The path curved slightly to the right, and the trees got thicker. The moonlight was coming through in patches, creating these eerie patterns of light and shadow on the ground. I was about a quarter of the way through when a bat flapped right over my head, so close I could feel the air from its wings. I ducked instinctively, even though it was already gone. That's when I noticed how quiet it was. Usually the Australian bush at night is anything but silent. There's always crickets, frogs, nightbirds, all sorts of noises. But that night, nothing. Just this heavy silence that felt like it was pressing down on me. I started pedaling faster. I wasn't properly scared yet, just uneasy, like something wasn't right. Then I heard it. What sounded like heavy, galloping footsteps somewhere to my left and behind me. At first, I thought it might be a kangaroo. They make a thumping sound when they hop at speed. But this was different, heavier, more deliberate. I didn't stop to look. I just pedaled harder, hunching down over the handlebars to make myself go faster. The path got rougher here, with exposed tree roots and small rocks that made the bike rattle. The sound of footsteps seemed to be keeping pace with me, maybe even getting closer. I was approaching the halfway point, where there was a small clearing. In daylight, people sometimes stopped there to rest. At night, it was just this open space where the moonlight came through more clearly. As I entered the clearing, the footsteps behind me stopped abruptly. For a split second, I felt relieved. Then I saw it. On the far side of the clearing, something massive emerged from the tall grass. At first, it was on all fours, and my brain tried to make sense of what I was seeing. A feral pig maybe, or even a lost cow. But it was much bigger than either of those. In the moonlight it looked most like a grizzly bear, though we don't have those in Australia. Then it stood up. I'll never forget this as long as I live. This thing rose up on its hind legs to stand at least 8 or 9 feet tall. Its arms were long, unnaturally long, hanging down almost to its knees. It was covered in what looked like straggly, matted hair. The silhouette was clear in the moonlight, broad shoulders, no neck to speak of, just this massive head sitting directly on those shoulders. Time seemed to freeze for a moment. We were maybe 30 feet apart, me on my bike, 1 foot on the ground to balance, and this creature, standing motionless at the edge of the clearing. I couldn't make out its face clearly, thank God, but I had the distinct impression it was looking right at me. Then it moved, not walking, not running like a human. It moved like a bloody ape, using its long arms, almost like another set of legs, but still staying primarily upright. And it was fast, much faster than something that size should be able to move. And it was coming straight for me. I've never been so terrified in my entire life. I pushed off hard and started pedaling like my life depended on it, because I genuinely believed it did. I wasn't thinking clearly anymore, just acting on pure adrenaline and fear. I was flying over the track, not even trying to avoid the bumps and holes anymore. I hit a particularly rough patch and heard the spokes on my back wheel snap as I bounced over a root or rock, but the wheel held together enough for me to keep going. The bike was making this horrible rattling noise now, but I didn't care. All I could focus on was getting out of there. I could hear it behind me, this heavy breathing and those thundering footsteps. They didn't sound like 2 feet anymore, but like a mixture of feet and hands hitting the ground. I didn't dare look back. I just kept my eyes fixed on the path ahead, desperately looking for the exit. The last section of the track was the worst. It narrowed and got steeper, with a small incline leading up to the road. Under normal circumstances, I would have gotten off and pushed the bike up, but there was no way I was slowing down. I stood up on the pedals, using every bit of strength I had left to power up that hill. I burst out onto the road at the other end, nearly colliding with a parked car. I still didn't stop. I just swerved around it and kept going, pedaling frantically toward Dave's house, which was about 200 meters down the road. Only when I was on Dave's street did I finally dare to look over my shoulder. The exit to the track was empty. Whatever that thing was, it hadn't followed me out into the open. But I swear I could feel it watching from the darkness between those trees. I practically fell off my bike in Dave's driveway. I must have looked like death itself when he opened the door, white as a ghost, covered in sweat despite the cold night, hands shaking so bad I couldn't even hold the glass of water he gave me. I tried to explain what happened, but I was babbling like an idiot. Dave thought at first I'd been mugged or something. When I finally managed to tell him about the creature, he got real quiet. He didn't laugh or tell me I was crazy. He just asked one question. Was it a yowie? I'd heard the stories, like I said, but I'd never really believed them until that moment. Some of the indigenous folks in the area had warned about these creatures for generations. There'd been sightings reported in that very tract of bush going back decades. I stayed at Dave's that night. There was no way I was going back out, even though my place was only on the other side of that shortcut. My bike was wrecked. The back wheel was bent all to hell, spokes snapped, and the frame itself was cracked from the stress I'd put it under. The next day, Dave drove me home the long way around. We didn't talk much about what happened. In the daylight, with people around, it was easier to try to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a really big kangaroo. Maybe it was some kind of escaped exotic animal. Maybe I'd just panicked in the dark and imagined the worst. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen. And I never, ever used that track again, day or night. I ended up selling my place and moving to another suburb entirely about 3 months later. I just couldn't stand being that close to those woods anymore. It's been over 40 years now, and I've told this story maybe 3 times total. Most people don't believe me, and I don't blame them. I wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. Sometimes I wonder if it's still there, in that stretch of bush between the housing estates. Queensland's developed a lot since the 70s, and that area's probably all houses now. But whenever I hear about yowie sightings in other parts of Australia, I get this cold feeling in the pit of my stomach, because I know they're real. I don't care what the skeptics say or how ridiculous it sounds. I saw one with my own eyes, and I heard it chasing me through that dark stretch of bush on a winter night in 1978. And nothing will ever convince me otherwise. I still have nightmares about it sometimes. That moment when it stood up in the moonlight and I realized what I was looking at. In my dreams, I don't always make it out of that clearing. I wake up in a cold sweat, feeling those footsteps vibrating through the ground behind me. You can believe me or not, that's up to you. But if you're ever in the Australian bush at night and the natural sounds go quiet, don't stick around to find out why. Some things are better left alone in the darkness. Story 2. I've been debating whether to post this for over 40 years now. I'm not looking for attention or trying to convince anyone of anything. I just need to get this off my chest because it's eaten away at me all these years, and I'm tired of keeping it bottled up. This happened back in September 1978. I was 26 years old, living in New South Wales, Australia. My buddy Thomas and I were driving back from a fishing trip along the New Well Highway. It was around 9 at night, and the road was pitch black, except for our headlights cutting through the darkness. We'd caught a decent haul that day, 4 nice-sized barramundi, and were having a good laugh about how Tom had nearly fallen into the water trying to reel one in. The radio was playing some AC/DC song, and Tom was tapping along on the dashboard. We were about 2 hours from home, and both pretty knackered from being up since dawn. I was driving my old Ford Ute. Not much to look at, but reliable enough to get us where we needed to go. "Mate, I'm bloody starving," Tom said, digging through our cooler for the sandwiches we'd packed that morning. "There should be a few left," I replied, keeping my eyes on the road. The highway was deserted at that time of night, which wasn't unusual for that stretch. That's when I first saw it. Our headlights caught something in the middle of the road about 100 meters ahead. At first glance, it looked like a big wild pig hunched over something on the asphalt. "Look at that," I said, slowing down. "Bloody big pig, isn't it?" Tom leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. "Yeah, looks like it's having a feed on something." As we got closer, we could see it was tearing at what appeared to be a kangaroo carcass. Nothing unusual there. Roadkill was common, and feral pigs would often come out at night to scavenge. I slowed down to about 40 kilometers per hour, not wanting to hit the thing. The headlights were fully illuminating it now, and that's when things started to feel wrong. "That's a bloody big pig," Tom muttered, but there was uncertainty in his voice. We were about 60 meters away when everything changed. The pig suddenly stood up on its hind legs. My foot instinctively hit the brake, bringing us down to a crawl. What we were looking at wasn't a pig. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. The thing was enormous, had to be nearly 3 meters tall. It was covered in thick, shaggy hair, a reddish-brown color that looked almost rust-colored in our headlights. The build of this creature was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Massively broad shoulders, powerfully built, but with proportions that were all wrong. It had no visible neck to speak of, its small head seeming to sit directly on those huge shoulders. "What the fuck is that?" Tom whispered, his sandwich forgotten in his lap. I couldn't answer. My throat had gone bone dry. The creature turned toward our approaching vehicle, and I swear I could see its eyes reflect our headlights. 2 yellowish orbs staring back at us. "Jesus Christ," I managed to say. I slowed down to about 30 kilometers per hour, uncertain what to do. My instinct was to floor it and get past this thing as quickly as possible, but some mix of fear and curiosity kept me moving at that crawl. As we got closer, maybe 20 meters away, the most ungodly stench hit us. I'd left the windows halfway down due to the mild evening, and suddenly the car was filled with a smell so foul it made my eyes water. It was like rotting meat, wet dog, and something else I can't even describe, musky and wild and completely alien. "Fuck me dead," Tom gagged, rolling up his window. "What is that smell?" I was too stunned to respond, too focused on the creature that was now fully standing, watching our approach. Its arms hung at its sides, unnaturally long, with hands that seemed too large for even its massive frame. We were almost alongside it now, moving at that same slow pace. I couldn't take my eyes off it, even as I struggled not to vomit from the smell. The creature hadn't moved since standing up, just watching us with what seemed like curiosity, intelligence. I don't know, but it wasn't the mindless stare of an animal. There was something behind those eyes that chilled me to my core. Just as we were passing it, the thing couldn't have been more than 5 meters from my window. It made its move. In one fluid motion, it bent down, grabbed the kangaroo carcass it had been feeding on, and loped off into the darkness beside the road. The speed was incredible for something so large. Within seconds, it had vanished into the bush, with only the swaying of some small trees indicating its path. I hit the brakes, and the car skidded to a halt. "Did you fucking see that?" Tom was practically shouting, his face pale in the dim light of the car interior. "Yeah," was all I could manage. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. What the hell was it? Some kind of massive ape? There aren't supposed to be any bloody apes in Australia. I shook my head. "I don't know, mate. I've never seen anything like it." We sat there in silence for maybe 30 seconds, both of us trying to process what we'd just witnessed. Then Tom said something that made my blood run cold. We should follow it. I turned to look at him, certain he was joking. He wasn't. "Are you out of your mind?" I asked. "That thing was 3 meters tall and built like a brick shithouse, and you want to chase after it in the dark?" "We might never get another chance to see something like this," Tom argued. "Think about it, James. Whatever that was, it's not supposed to exist. We could make history here." "With what?" "Our bare hands and a fishing rod. What exactly is your plan if we find it?" Tom reached into the glove compartment and pulled out the small camera he'd brought for the fishing trip. "We get evidence." For a brief moment, I actually considered it. The thought of discovering some unknown creature, of being the ones to prove its existence. It was tempting. But then I remembered the way it had moved, the intelligence in its eyes, and that unholy stench. "No," I said firmly. "No way. We're not equipped for this, and we have no idea what that thing is capable of. For all we know, it could tear us apart like it was doing to that kangaroo." Tom wanted to argue, but something in my expression must have told him it was pointless. "Fine," he muttered, putting the camera away. "But we're going to regret this." I put the car back in gear and started driving again, faster now, wanting to put as much distance between us and that spot as possible. The smell still lingered in the car, and I rolled down my window despite the cool night air, desperate to clear it out. Neither of us spoke for a good 15 minutes. The radio kept playing, but I'd turned it down so low it was barely audible. Every shadow by the roadside made me tense up. Every rustle in the bush as we passed had me checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that thing loping after us on all fours. "Do you reckon it was a yowie?" Tom finally asked. I'd heard the stories of the yowie, Australia's version of Bigfoot or the Yeti, but had always dismissed them as campfire tales or indigenous legends. Now I wasn't so sure. "I don't know what it was," I replied honestly, "but it wasn't human, and it wasn't any animal I've ever heard of." "We should report it," Tom suggested. "Call the rangers or the police when we get back." I snorted at that. "And tell them what? That we saw some giant hairy monster eating roadkill? They'll think we're drunk or high or both." "But what if it's dangerous? What if it attacks someone?" "It didn't attack us, did it? It had every chance, but it just grabbed its dinner and ran off." Tom fell silent again, and I could tell he was struggling with the same questions I was. What was that thing? Where had it come from? How many more might be out there? For the rest of the drive home, we kept the conversation light, talking about anything but what we'd seen. But the tension never left the car. Every now and then, one of us would glance nervously out the window or check the mirror. When I finally dropped Tom off at his place, he paused before getting out of the car. "We know what we saw, James," he said quietly. "No matter what anyone else might think, we know." I nodded. "Yeah, we do. I'm going to look into it, see if there've been any other sightings around here. Just be careful what you say to people," I warned him. "You know how small towns talk." We left it at that. I drove home, took the longest shower of my life trying to get the lingering stench off me, and lay awake till dawn, replaying the encounter over and over in my mind. The next day, I half convinced myself it had been some kind of mass hallucination. Maybe we'd been exposed to carbon monoxide from my old car, or maybe the mushrooms Tom had put in our lunch sandwiches weren't the normal kind. But deep down, I knew what we'd seen was real. Tom and I talked about it a few times over the following weeks, but less and less as time went on. He did his research, found some Aboriginal stories about the Yowie that matched aspects of what we'd seen, but nothing conclusive. No one else had reported seeing anything similar in the area, at least not officially. Life went on. I moved to Brisbane a year later for work. Tom and I drifted apart, as mates sometimes do. I heard he got married, had kids. I did the same, built a normal life, but I never went camping or fishing again, could never bring myself to drive on a dark country road at night. And to this day, 43 years later, I sometimes wake up in a cold sweat, the image of that creature burned into my mind, and that awful smell in my nostrils. What haunts me most isn't just what we saw, it's what it implies. If something that size, that unusual, could exist without being properly documented, what else is out there in the bush that we don't know about? How many other legends are actually flesh and blood creatures that have managed to avoid human detection? And sometimes, on stormy nights when I can't sleep, I wonder if Tom was right. Should we have followed it? Should we have tried to get evidence? Or would we have never made it back to the car? I'll never know. But I do know what I saw that night on the New Well Highway, and it wasn't a pig, a man, or any known animal. Whatever it was something else entirely, something that, according to science, shouldn't exist. But it does. I saw it with my own eyes. And sometimes, I can't shake the feeling that somewhere out there in the vast Australian bush, it's watching, waiting, and remembering us just as clearly as we remember it. Story 3. This happened to me back in 1978, and I've never been able to shake it. I've told a few people over the years, but I mostly get those looks, you know the ones, like I've lost my mind or had one too many at the pub. But I know what I saw that night, and it wasn't human, not even close. I was 23 then, driving coal trucks for White Industries. Young bloke, thought I knew everything. I had the night route between Uland and Mudge in Australia, which was fine by me. Quiet roads, no traffic, good money. The company had fitted these massive spotlights on my Kenworth, not just for my visibility, but mainly to spot kangaroos. If you've never driven Australian backroads at night, you wouldn't understand how dangerous those hoppers can be. Hit one at speed, and it's not just the roo that's in trouble. It was October 30th, just before Halloween, which isn't as big in Australia as it is elsewhere, but the date stuck with me for obvious reasons. The shift had been boring as usual. I'd made my pickup at Uland around 10 in the evening and was on the return leg to Mudge. Must have been close to midnight by then. The road was your typical Australian back route, narrow, winding in places, surrounded by dense bush. No streetlights, no houses, nothing but wilderness for kilometers. Just my headlights cutting through the darkness and those spotlights sweeping the roadside. I remember I was chewing gum to stay alert, and had the radio on low, some late-night talk show discussing politics or something equally mind-numbing. I was probably doing about 70 kilometers per hour, not pushing it because the road had some nasty bends. At first, I thought it was just another hitchhiker. You'd occasionally see them even at that hour, though not often on such isolated stretches. This figure was on the opposite side of the road, walking away from me. Nothing alarming about that. But as I got closer, something felt off. The proportions weren't right. My brain was trying to process what my eyes were seeing, but the two weren't connecting properly. This person was getting taller the closer I got. Not just tall, impossibly tall. I slowed the truck a bit, curious now. The spotlights were sweeping that side of the road, and I adjusted them slightly to get a better look. That's when it happened. The figure stopped and turned. Not just its head, its whole upper body rotated toward me in this unnaturally fluid motion, and its eyes... Jesus Christ, its eyes caught the light and reflected back this intense, bright red glow. Like how sheep's eyes reflect at night, but much brighter, much more aware. I nearly shat myself right there in the driver's seat. My hands gripped the wheel so tight my knuckles went white. Those weren't human eyes. No way. They were set too wide apart on what I could now make out was a massive head. I'm not ashamed to admit I panicked a bit. I hit the brakes harder than I should have. And for one terrifying moment, I thought the trailer might jackknife. 15 tons of coal behind you doesn't stop on a dime. And if that trailer had swung around, I'd have been in serious trouble. Somehow, I kept it straight, the tires screeching on the asphalt. The engine growled in protest as we slowed. The truck hadn't fully stopped before the thing turned and walked into the bush on the side of the road. But it didn't run like someone scared of getting caught trespassing. It moved with these huge, loping strides, casual-like, almost contemptuous, like I wasn't worth being afraid of. I sat there for maybe 30 seconds, engine idling, trying to process what I'd just seen. Part of me wanted to drive off immediately, put as much distance between me and whatever that was. But another part, the stupid, curious part, made me stay. The truck's spotlights were still pointed toward where the creature had disappeared. The bush was thick there, but there was a small clearing about 20 meters in. And that's when I saw it again. It had stopped at the edge of the clearing and turned back toward the road, toward me, standing fully upright now on two legs. Even from that distance, I could tell it was massive, over 3 meters tall, easy. Its proportions were all wrong for a human. Arms too long, they hung down near its knees. And the width of it must have been at least 1 meter wide at the shoulders. The whole body was covered in this straight, dark hair. Brownish black, I'd say, though colors are hard to judge under spotlights at night. The hair wasn't super long, maybe 3 or 4 inches, but it covered everything except parts of its face. Around the eyes and nose, the skin looked bare. But the most unnerving thing was the way its head moved. As it stood there watching me, its head rotated, and I mean rotated, not just turned, almost completely around without its body moving much. No human neck can do that. The movement was smooth, fluid like an owl's, but on this massive humanoid body. We locked eyes for what felt like forever, but was probably only seconds. Those red, reflective eyes just studying me, not with fear or aggression, with intelligence, recognition even, like it was memorizing me. Then it simply turned and walked deeper into the bush. 3, maybe 4 strides of those massive legs, and it was gone. Disappeared into the darkness beyond my light's reach. I sat there trembling for God knows how long. My shirt was soaked with sweat, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. When I finally exhaled, it came out as a shaky, pathetic sound that embarrassed me, even though no one was there to hear it. Eventually, I put the truck in gear and continued toward Mudge. What else could I do? I couldn't exactly call someone. This was 1978, no mobile phones. The nearest emergency phone was probably 20 kilometers away. I drove well under the speed limit the rest of the way, constantly checking my mirrors and scanning the bush on both sides of the road. Every shadow looked like that thing about to step out again. Every tree trunk could have been its massive form. When I finally reached the depot in Mudge, I was a complete wreck. My supervisor took one look at me and asked if I'd had an accident. I considered telling him what I'd seen, but what would I say? Hey mate, just saw a 3-meter tall hairy bloke with glowing red eyes and a rotating head out on the Uland Road. Yeah, right. I'd be off the roster faster than you could say psych evaluation. So I mumbled something about nearly hitting a kangaroo and feeling a bit shaken. He seemed to buy it, told me to take it easy on the way home. I didn't sleep at all that night. Kept the lights on in my small rental and sat in the living room with a cricket bat by my side until sunrise. Ridiculous, I know. If that thing wanted to come for me, a cricket bat wasn't going to do much good. But it made me feel a tiny bit better. The next day, I called in sick. Couldn't face getting back in that truck, not so soon. I spent the day at the local library, trying to find any information about strange sightings in the area. The librarian must have thought I was nuts, asking for books about giant hairy creatures in the Australian bush. I found a few vague mentions of yowies, Australia's version of Bigfoot or Sasquatch, I suppose. Aboriginal legends talked about hairy men in the forests, but none of the descriptions mentioned the rotating head or the glowing red eyes. And most of the supposed sightings were from much further north, in Queensland or northern New South Wales. Not near Mudge. I've spent years trying to make sense of what I saw that night. I've read everything I could find on cryptids, unknown hominids, even alien encounters. Nothing quite matches my experience. The size alone sets it apart. Most Bigfoot sightings in America describe creatures maybe 2 to 2.5 meters tall. This thing was bigger, over 3 meters, I'm certain, and the way it moved, that unnatural head rotation. I've never read about anything similar. I kept driving that route for another year before quitting White Industries. Every night on that stretch of road, my heart would race and I'd break out in a cold sweat. I never saw the creature again, but I felt watched every time I passed that spot. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, or think I saw those red eyes reflecting in the distance, but nothing concrete. Nothing I could point to and say, see, I'm not crazy. I'm 47 years older now and I still think about it, still dream about those eyes sometimes, still wake up in a panic, thinking I hear those heavy footsteps outside my window. I've tried to rationalize it over the years. Maybe it was some kind of mutated kangaroo standing upright. But kangaroos don't have that kind of head movement, and their eyes don't reflect red like that. A person in a costume? Not a chance. No costume could capture that fluid movement, and nobody makes a 3-meter tall costume with mechanical rotating heads, especially not back in '78. I've told my story to a few researchers over the years. Most listen politely, then file me under probable hallucination or sleep-deprived trucker. I get it. If someone told me this story, I'd be skeptical too, but I know what I saw. I was stone-cold sober, wide awake, and those spotlights on my truck were industrial grade. They lit up the road and surrounding bush clear as day. There was no mistaking it. Whatever it was watching me from the bush that night, it wasn't human. It wasn't any known animal. And sometimes, in my darkest thoughts, I wonder if it was even from this world at all. The intelligence in those eyes haunts me more than anything. It wasn't just looking at me. It was reading me, understanding me. I've been back to that stretch of road a few times over the decades. It's changed. They widened it about 15 years ago, cleared more of the bush back from the shoulder. Progress, they call it. But I wonder what else they might have cleared away or driven deeper into the wilderness. The last time I visited was about 5 years ago. I pulled over near where I thought the encounter happened. It was daylight, a beautiful, clear Australian afternoon, birds singing, insects buzzing, normal, peaceful. I stood there looking into the trees and wondering if it was still out there somewhere, still watching with those intelligent red eyes. If it had seen the roads widen, the towns grow, more and more of its habitat getting swallowed up. I called out, felt like an idiot doing it, but I called out anyway, asked if it was there, said I meant no harm, that I just wanted to understand. Nothing answered, of course. Just the wind in the eucalyptus trees and a kookaburra laughing at me from somewhere overhead. But as I was getting back in my car, I noticed something odd. About 20 meters into the bush, right about where the clearing had been that night, there was a tree with strange markings on it. 3 parallel grooves in the bark, too high up for a normal person to reach without a ladder, too uniform to be natural damage, too deep to be recent. I didn't go check it out. Some primal part of my brain screamed at me to get back in the car, to drive away. And I listened. Whatever I saw that night in October '78, I don't have an explanation for it. I just know it was real, it was intelligent, and somewhere out in the Australian bush, it might still be watching and waiting. And sometimes when I'm driving on dark country roads at night, I still check my mirrors a little more often than I need to, half expecting to see those red eyes glowing back at me from the darkness. Story 4. I've been holding this in for so long that I need to finally share it with people who might understand. Even after all these years, my hands still shake when I think about it. This happened back in October of '78 outside Toowoomba, and I swear on my mother's grave that every word is true. There were 5 of us that day. Me, James, my cousins Daryl and Kevin, and our mates Charlie and Rob. We'd gone out to the bushland to check some hunting spots and do a bit of fishing at the creek. Nothing unusual about that. We'd been going there since we were kids. Our families have been on that land for generations, and we know those woods better than anyone. It was starting to get late, maybe around 4 in the afternoon, when we decided to head back to town. The sky was getting that orange-pink color, and we knew darkness would come fast out there. We piled into my old Ford pickup. She wasn't much to look at, but she'd always gotten us where we needed to go. Not that day, though. We'd gone maybe 3 kilometers down that dirt track when the engine started making this horrible grinding noise. Then smoke started coming from under the hood. I pulled over and we all got out to take a look. The radiator was completely blown, and something had gone wrong with the fan belt too. There was no fixing it there on the spot. "Well, this is bloody brilliant," Daryl said, kicking at the dirt. "What now?" We were about 5 kilometers from town, and night was coming on quick. None of us had those newfangled CB radios, and this was long before mobile phones. We had 2 options: either stay with the truck until morning, or walk back to town. Since none of us fancied spending the night in the bush with the snakes and spiders, we decided to walk. We grabbed our torches from the glove box and our gear from the back. I remember checking my watch. It was nearly 6, and the sun was already starting to dip behind the trees. In October, darkness comes on quick in the bush. If we keep a good pace, we should hit the main road in about an hour, I said. The narrow track was only wide enough for 1 vehicle, with dense scrub and eucalyptus trees pressing in from both sides. During the day, it was beautiful. At night, it was different. The first 30 minutes of walking were uneventful. The bush was alive with sound, kookaburras giving their last laughs of the day, cicadas buzzing, the occasional rustle in the undergrowth. Normal stuff. We were all in decent spirits, cracking jokes about who would have to pay the NRMA to go get the truck tomorrow. Then the sun finally disappeared and darkness descended like a blanket. We switched on our torches and kept walking, our conversation becoming quieter as the bush noises grew louder in the dark. There's something about nightfall in the Australian bush that makes you speak more softly, like you don't want to draw attention to yourself. Kevin was bringing up the rear, and I was at the front. We'd fallen into single file as the track narrowed in places. That's when everything changed. "Hey!" "Did you fellas hear that?" Kevin called from behind. We all stopped and turned around. "Hear what?" Charlie asked, shining his torch back down the track. "I dunno. Sounded like something big moving through the brush," Kevin said, his voice tense. "There it is again." This time we all heard it, a cracking of branches, like something heavy was pushing through the undergrowth. In the bush, you get used to the sounds of wallabies or roos moving about, but this was different, heavier, more deliberate. "Probably just a big roo," Rob said, but he didn't sound convinced. Kevin aimed his torch down the track behind us. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the dust and the scrub on either side. Then it caught something else, something that made my blood run cold. Standing in the middle of the track, maybe 30 meters behind us, was a tall, dark figure. At first, I thought it might be another person, but it was too big, too wrong. It was covered in what looked like dark hair or fur, standing completely still, watching us. "What the hell is that?" Charlie whispered. "The thing about growing up part Aboriginal is that you hear the old stories. Not just the sanitized versions they tell tourists, but the real ones, passed down through families. Stories about the Doola Garrel, what white fellas might call a yowie, or Australian Bigfoot. As kids, we'd laugh at those stories. We weren't laughing now. "It's a bloody Doola Garrel," Darryl said, his voice barely audible. "Don't be stupid," Rob replied, but I could hear the fear in his voice. "Those are just stories." The figure hadn't moved, but there was something about the way it stood there, patient, watching, waiting, that turned my guts to water. I'd never believed in the stories, not really, but in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty what we were looking at. "Kevin, give it more light," I said. Kevin adjusted his torch, and the beam fully illuminated the figure. It was tall, at least 2 meters, maybe more, covered in dark, shaggy hair from head to foot. Its arms hung down past its knees, ending in massive hands. But it was the face that got me. Broad, flat, almost gorilla-like, but with a distinctly human quality that made it all the more terrifying. Its eyes caught the torchlight and reflected back, like a cat's or a possum's, but much, much bigger. "Holy shit," someone whispered. Might have been me. For what felt like forever, we all just stood there, frozen, staring at this thing. Then it took a step toward us. "What do we do?" Charlie asked, panic rising in his voice. I remembered something my grandfather had told me once about the Doola Garrel, that they hated bright light in their eyes. It was one of those things the old people said would keep you safe. "Shine your torches right in its eyes," I shouted. "All of them. The elders say they hate the light." We all aimed our torches directly at the creature's face. It raised one of those massive hands to shield its eyes, but kept coming forward. One step, then another. Slow, deliberate steps. "It's not working," Rob yelled. "Throw something at it." Kevin shouted, already bending down to grab a rock from the track. We all started picking up whatever we could find, rocks, sticks, even handfuls of dirt, and hurling them at the creature. Most of our throws fell short, but a few hit their mark. The Doola Garrel didn't even flinch. It just kept coming, now only about 20 meters away. "Run!" I shouted. "Run now!" We turned and sprinted down the track, not daring to look back. I could hear heavy footfalls behind us, branches breaking as something large moved through the bush, parallel to the track. The sound was getting closer. My lungs were burning, and my legs felt like lead, but terror kept me moving. I have no idea how far or how long we ran. It could have been a kilometer or just a few hundred meters. Finally, we couldn't run anymore and collapsed against a fallen log, gasping for breath. Is it still behind us?" Darryl wheezed, too scared to look. I turned and pointed my torch back down the track. Nothing, just empty darkness. We sat there for several minutes, catching our breath, listening intently. The bush had gone unnaturally quiet. No insects chirping, no night birds calling, just our ragged breathing and the pounding of blood in my ears. "I think we lost it," Charlie said eventually. "What the hell was that thing?" Rob asked, his voice shaking. You know bloody well what it was, Kevin replied. It was a doula garrel, just like the elders always warned us about. Those are just stories, Rob insisted, but his voice had no conviction. Did that look like just a story to you? I asked. Nobody answered. We all knew what we'd seen. After a few more minutes, we picked ourselves up and continued walking, much faster now, keeping close together. Nobody wanted to be at the back of the group anymore. We kept all our torches on, sweeping them from side to side, jumping at every sound. The track seemed longer in the dark, endless. The trees pressed in from both sides, creating shadows that seemed to move and shift with each step. Every crack of a twig made us freeze. Every rustle in the undergrowth had us pointing our torches wildly. Finally, after what felt like hours, we saw the reflective sign that marked the junction with the sealed road. Just another 100 meters or so, and we'd be on the main road back to town. We picked up our pace, almost running again. That's when Darryl stopped dead in his tracks. Oh, Jesus! I followed his gaze and felt my heart drop into my stomach. Standing in the middle of the track, blocking our path to the road, was the doula garrel. It had somehow gotten ahead of us, cutting us off from town. In the combined beams of our torches, I could see it clearly now. It stood upright, like a man, but much taller and broader. Its body was covered in dark hair, almost black, but with a reddish tint in places. The face was the worst part, not quite human, not quite animal. Its eyes were deep set beneath a heavy brow, its nose broad and flat. Its mouth was wide, lips pulled back slightly to reveal teeth that looked too big for its face. As we stood there, frozen in terror, it made a sound, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath our feet. It wasn't like any animal sound I'd ever heard. There was intelligence behind it, purpose. "What do we do?" Charlie whispered. "We can't go back." I was frantically trying to remember everything my grandfather had ever told me about the doula garral. They were supposed to be territorial, but not necessarily aggressive unless provoked. They were said to be curious about humans, but generally avoided contact. "Don't run," I said quietly. "That's what it wants. We need to stand our ground." It felt like the hardest thing I'd ever done, standing there facing that creature. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and flee, but somehow we all held our positions, torches pointed directly at the doula garrel. For what felt like an eternity, we stood in this deadlock, neither side moving. Then, slowly, the creature took a step to the side, then another. It was moving off the track into the dense scrub beside it. We didn't move, didn't breathe as it gradually made its way to the edge of the track. Before disappearing into the darkness, it turned its head to look at us one last time. In that moment, I swear I saw something in its eyes, not just animal intelligence, but something deeper, something that knew us. Then it was gone, the brush closing behind it as it melted into the night. We waited a full minute before moving, then walked quickly, almost running, the remaining distance to the sealed road. Only when our feet hit the asphalt did we dare to look back. There, standing in the middle of the track, was the doula garrel again. It made no move to follow us onto the road, just stood watching. Then it turned and walked deliberately back into the bush, disappearing from sight. We practically ran the remaining distance to town, not speaking, each lost in our own thoughts. When we finally reached the first streetlight, we stopped and looked at each other. We were filthy, scratched, and still shaking with fear. "We don't tell anyone about this," Rob said finally. "They'll think we're crazy or drunk." We all nodded in agreement, though for different reasons. Rob and Charlie because they didn't want to be ridiculed. Kevin, Darryl, and me because we knew what would happen if word got out about a doula garral so close to town. There would be men with guns heading into the bush, looking for it. And somehow, that felt wrong. The next day, we called the NRMA to recover the truck. None of us went with them. In fact, none of us have used that track since that night. Some places you just don't go back to. It's been years now, and I've never told this story to anyone outside of our group. Even now, I'm not sure why I'm sharing it. Maybe because I'm getting older, and I don't want this experience to die with me. Or maybe because I need to know if anyone else has seen what we saw. All I know is that the bush holds secrets older than any of us. And sometimes, just sometimes, those secrets step out of the shadows and onto the track in front of you. And when they do, all the stories your elders told you suddenly don't seem like just stories anymore. Story 5. I've never really talked about this outside my immediate family, but after seeing others share similar experiences here, I think I'm finally ready. This happened back in '78 when I was 14, and even though it's been over 40 years, I still get goosebumps thinking about it. I grew up in New South Wales, Australia, near Grafton. If you're not familiar with the area, it's pretty rural with loads of untouched bush country. My school offered whitewater kayaking as a sport option, which was brilliant for adventurous kids like me. Most schools in the Northern Rivers region had similar programs since we had so many great river systems nearby. That particular week in October, our school had organized a 3-day canoeing expedition along one of the more remote river systems. There were about 30 of us students, ranging from 13 to 16 years old, plus 4 teachers supervising. The plan was to camp overnight at this river junction halfway down a gorge, then continue downstream the next day. The first day went normally enough. We paddled for about 6 hours, stopping occasionally for rest and lunch. By mid-afternoon, we reached our planned campsite at the junction of 2 rivers. It was a beautiful spot, this flat clearing surrounded by dense bush on one side and steep rock walls on the other. The water was crystal clear, flowing over smooth rocks before deepening into this perfect swimming hole. After setting up camp, most kids were knackered and just lounged around. My mate Danny and I still had energy to burn, so we asked Mr. Holden, our PE teacher, if we could paddle upstream a bit to fish at this spot we'd spotted earlier. He agreed, but told us to be back before sunset, which gave us about 2 hours. So we grabbed our fishing gear and pushed our canoe back into the water. It was probably around 4 in the afternoon, still plenty of daylight left. The gorge walls rose up on either side of us as we paddled upstream, making everything feel more closed in and isolated. The sounds echoed strangely off the rock faces, our paddles splashing, birds calling from somewhere above us. After paddling about a mile upstream, we reached these shallow rapids I remembered seeing on the way down. Just above them was this perfect backwash area where fish often gather. We couldn't paddle through the rapids, so we pulled the canoe onto a small gravelly beach and secured it to a tree root. "Should be good fishing up there," Danny said, grabbing his rod and tackle box. The bank was too steep and rocky to walk along, so we had to climb up about 20 feet from the water's edge and then follow a sort of natural path through the scrub. It was rough going, lots of loose rocks, spiny bushes grabbing at our clothes, and these massive boulders we had to clamber over. After about 10 minutes of walking, we reached the fishing spot. On one side was the river. On the other was this almost vertical rock face, probably 100 feet high. Between us and the cliff was a patch of long grass and some scattered boulders. The whole area was in shadow already, with the late afternoon sun blocked by the gorge walls. Danny went straight to the water's edge to set up his fishing rod, but something caught my eye on the ground. There was a patch of soft mud near the base of the rock face, and in it was this footprint. Not just any footprint. This thing was massive. Had to be over a foot long and easily twice as wide as my size 7 sneakers. "Danny!" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Come look at this!" He trudged over, annoyed at being interrupted before he could cast his line. When he saw what I was pointing at, he went quiet. "That's not a roo," he finally said. "Australia has plenty of wildlife, but nothing with a foot that size and shape. It looked almost human, but way too big and with weird proportions. The toes were splayed out more. Could be a hoax, Danny suggested, but his voice didn't sound convinced. We were a good mile upstream from camp, through difficult terrain. Who would bother coming all the way out here to make fake footprints? While we were staring at it, trying to make sense of what we were seeing, I noticed something else. Tracks in the rock face, not footprints this time, but these scratch marks that formed a kind of path up the cliff. They were worn into the rock, like something had used the same route many times, wearing grooves into the stone. Then the smell hit us. It's hard to describe exactly, but imagine something dead mixed with wet dog and this musky, almost human body odor. It was overpowering, making my eyes water. "What's that stink?" Danny whispered, pulling his t-shirt up over his nose. That's when I heard it, rustling in the long grass between us and the rock face. At first, I thought it might be a wallaby or something small, but the way the grass was moving, it was too deliberate. We both froze, watching the grass part, and then it stood up. I still struggled to describe exactly what I saw. It wasn't a man, but it wasn't an animal I recognized either. It was about 5 to 5.5 feet tall, not massive like you hear in American Bigfoot stories, but still bigger than me at the time. It was covered in light brown, dusty tan hair, not super thick, but enough to cover its skin. The face was wrong, flatter than a human's, with a pronounced brow ridge and a wide, almost lipless mouth. For maybe 2 seconds, we just stared at each other. Its eyes were dark and surprisingly intelligent looking. There was this moment of what felt like mutual shock, like it was as surprised to see us as we were to see it. Then it moved. Jesus, the speed of it. 1 second it was standing there, the next it was sprinting toward the cliff face. It didn't run like a person. It was more fluid, almost like it was gliding over the ground. When it reached the rock wall, it didn't slow down at all. It just scaled it, like a monkey or a lizard, finding handholds and footholds I couldn't even see from where I stood. The creature climbed about 100 feet up in seconds, then stopped on this small ledge. It crouched down and turned to look at us. I could feel it watching us, studying us. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. Neither of us moved or spoke. We just stood there, looking up at this impossible thing as it looked back down at us. It stayed there for about a minute, though it felt like forever. Then it simply disappeared between some rocks. One moment it was there, the next it was gone. "What the fuck was that?" Danny's voice cracked. He was sheet white, and I imagine I looked the same. We didn't discuss what to do next. We just ran. I've never moved so fast in my life. We abandoned our fishing gear, scrambling back down the rocky path toward our canoe. I fell twice, scraping my knees badly, but I barely felt it. The adrenaline had taken over completely. We practically threw ourselves into the canoe, not even bothering to untie it properly. Danny just yanked until the root we'd tied to broke. We paddled like our lives depended on it, not saying a word to each other. Looking back, I'm amazed we didn't capsize in our panic. The mile back to camp seemed to take forever. The shadows were getting longer, and every rustle from the shoreline made us paddle harder. I kept imagining that thing running along the cliff tops above us, following us back to camp. When we finally rounded the bend and saw the tents and the campfire, I nearly cried with relief. We beached the canoe so hard we damaged the bow, but we didn't care. Mr. Holden saw us running up from the river's edge and immediately knew something was wrong. "What happened? Are you hurt?" he asked, grabbing my shoulders to steady me. We were both babbling, talking over each other, trying to explain what we'd seen. The other students gathered around us, some laughing, thinking it was a joke. "It was like an ape, but not exactly," I tried to explain. "It climbed the cliff like it was nothing." "It smelled awful," Danny added, "like something dead." Mr. Holden seemed concerned but skeptical. Miss Thompson, the biology teacher, suggested we might have seen a particularly large rock wallaby and gotten spooked. But Mr. Holden kept looking at Mr. Jindal, the history teacher, who hadn't said anything but was frowning deeply. There was also a local Aboriginal man named Uncle Dave who was helping guide our expedition. When we described what we saw, he went very still. He said something to the teachers in a low voice that I couldn't catch, but whatever it was made them take us more seriously. Mr. Holden instructed everyone to move their tents closer together. They built up the campfire much bigger than they'd originally planned, and the teachers took turns staying awake through the night. They told us it was just a precaution, but I could tell they were worried. My tent was at the edge of the group with some of the older boys. None of us slept that night. We kept hearing noises from the bush. Probably just normal nighttime sounds, but after what I'd seen, everything seemed threatening. At one point around 2 in the morning, I heard what sounded like rocks falling from the cliff face above our camp. One of the teachers shone a powerful torch up there but didn't see anything. The worst part was the smell. A couple of times during the night, that same rotting, musky odor drifted through our camp. It wasn't constant, just these occasional wafts that would come and go with the breeze. Every time I caught a whiff of it, my stomach would clench up and I'd break out in a cold sweat. When dawn finally came, Mr. Holden announced we'd be leaving earlier than planned. No one complained. We packed up in record time and were back on the water before the morning mist had fully cleared. I noticed Uncle Dave performing some kind of ritual before we left, splashing water in different directions and mumbling something under his breath. As we paddled away, I kept looking back at the cliff faces, half expecting to see that creature watching us leave. I didn't see anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. Later that day, when we were safely back at school, Mr. Jindal took Danny and me aside. He asked us not to talk too much about what we'd seen. "Some things in the bush are better left undisturbed," he said cryptically. "The Aboriginal people have stories about the hairy men of the gorges. They avoid certain areas for good reasons." I tried to research it afterward. I found out that the Aboriginal people of that region have stories about the Doolagal, or hairy man, a creature that sounds eerily similar to what we saw. Some descriptions even mention the same dusty tan coloring. I've never gone back to that spot. I gave up kayaking after that trip, despite having loved it before. I just couldn't face being in those isolated gorges again. Danny and I didn't talk about it much afterward. I think we both just wanted to forget. But I can't forget. That face, those intelligent eyes studying us, the impossible speed with which it climbed. These aren't things you make up or imagine. I know what I saw, even if I can't explain it. For years I thought maybe we'd just spooked ourselves, that it was some kind of animal I simply didn't recognize. But the older I get, the more convinced I am that there are things in the Australian bush that science hasn't catalogued yet. Things that know how to stay hidden, that have learned to avoid humans. Sometimes I still wake up from dreams where I'm back in that gorge, smelling that awful odor, watching that creature climb slopes that should be impossible to scale without equipment. And in the dreams, unlike reality, it doesn't just watch us from the ledge. It comes back down. Story 6. It's been over 40 years now, but I still can't explain what I saw that day. I've gone over it 1,000 times in my memory. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all, but then I remember Joey was there too. He saw it just as clearly as I did. And the way he reacted, well, that was proof enough it wasn't just in my head. This happened in 1978 when I was 8 years old. I lived in a small town in southern New South Wales. It wasn't much of a place, just a main street with some shops, a pub, and rows of weatherboard houses spread out along dusty roads. Our school sat at the edge of town, backed right up against the state forest that stretched for miles. That particular day in late autumn, the weather was perfect. Not too hot, not too cold. One of those clear blue days that makes you want to be anywhere but stuck inside. Joey, my best mate, and I had been planning to skip school for days. Joey was Aboriginal, from one of the local families that had been in the area forever. His grandfather told the best stories I'd ever heard, all about the land and creatures that lived in it long ago. Some of them gave me nightmares, but I couldn't get enough. "Let's do it today," Joey whispered during morning assembly. "Miss Parker's gonna make us do times tables all morning." I nodded, my heart already racing at the thought of bunking off. We'd never done it before, but everyone knew the best place to hide was the small hill across from the school. You could see everything from up there, but the teachers rarely bothered to check it. After roll call, we made our move. When everyone headed to class, we slipped around the back of the toilet block and through a hole in the fence that the older kids used to sneak out for smokes. We ran, crouched low across the empty lot beside the school until we reached the base of the hill. It wasn't much of a climb, just a gentle slope covered in long grass and scattered gum trees. At the top, we flopped down, breathless and giggling. "We actually did it!" I gasped, feeling like the most daring kid alive. "Told you it would be easy," Joey said, sitting up to peer down at the school grounds. "We can see if any teachers come looking." From our position, we had a perfect view. The school buildings, the concrete quadrangle where we had assembly, and beyond that, the large grassy field with its soccer pitch. The forest pressed right up against the far edge of the field, a dark green wall of eucalypts and scrubby undergrowth. For about an hour, we just hung out, picking at the grass, tossing rocks, and talking about stuff 8-year-old boys talk about. BMX bikes we wanted, who could climb the highest tree, whether sharks could beat crocodiles in a fight. Normal kid stuff. Then Joey suddenly went quiet. "What's that?" he said, pointing toward the edge of the forest. I squinted, scanning the tree line. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just the shadows between the trees. Then something moved. It stepped out from the forest edge, right by the corner of the soccer pitch. Even from this distance, maybe 200 meters away, I could tell it wasn't a person. Not a normal one, anyway. It was tall, really tall, taller than the soccer goals. Is that a person?" I asked, my voice coming out small. Joey's face had gone ashen. "Hairy man," he whispered. "What?" "Hairy man. My pop tells stories about them. They live in the bush." I looked back at the figure. It was moving slowly across the edge of the field, stopping every few steps like it was looking for something. Its movements were weird, sort of loping but deliberate, not like someone just out for a walk. As it moved into a patch of sunlight, I gasped. The creature was covered in hair, not like a person with hairy arms or legs, but completely covered, like an animal. And the hair wasn't dark like I'd expect from stories of hairy wild men. It was a burnt orange color, almost like rust. "Why is it orange?" I whispered. Joey just shook his head, his eyes wide and fixed on the creature. We watched, frozen in place, as it made its way along the edge of the field. It would stop, bend down to examine something on the ground, then move on. At one point it walked right up to one of the soccer goals. That's when I got a real sense of how big it was. Its head was level with the crossbar. That would make it, 7 or 8 feet tall? But it wasn't just tall. It was built solid. Wide shoulders, thick arms and legs. Not fat, but powerful looking. Everything about it screamed strength. The orangutan comparison came to mind immediately. I'd seen them at the zoo in Sydney on a school trip. But this wasn't an orangutan. It walked upright the whole time, for starters. The strangest part was its face. The burnt orange hair covered most of its body, but the face had less hair. From what I could see, the skin underneath was extremely dark, almost black, and the face shape wasn't ape-like at all. It was more human. The head was rounded, not sloped like a gorilla's. It had a forehead, a distinct nose, a mouth, but the proportions were off somehow. "We should go," Joey whispered urgently, tugging at my sleeve. "We need to get away from here." "It's not doing anything," I said, though my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "It's just walking around." "Pop says they take kids," Joey hissed. "The old people talk about it. Kids go into the bush and don't come back." That's when the first real wave of fear hit me. Until then, I'd been more fascinated than scared. But Joey's words changed something. I suddenly felt exposed on that hillside, like we were being watched even though the creature hadn't looked our way. The hairy man was now standing completely still near the center of the soccer pitch, facing the forest. It seemed to be listening or smelling the air, its head turned slowly, scanning the tree line. Then it turned in our direction. I don't know if it actually saw us. We were pretty far away and partially hidden by the long grass. But in that moment, when it seemed to be looking straight at us, pure terror washed over me. I screamed. It wasn't a conscious decision. The scream just erupted from somewhere deep inside me, raw and primal. Joey started screaming too, high-pitched and panicked. The hairy man's reaction was immediate. Its head snapped up, clearly startled by the noise. For a couple of seconds it stood frozen. Then it moved with shocking speed, loping back toward the forest on those long, powerful legs. In moments, it had disappeared into the trees. Our screams had attracted attention from the school. We saw figures running out onto the quadrangle, looking around for the source of the noise. 2 teachers, Mr. Dawson and Miss Parker, spotted us on the hill and started heading our way. "They're coming," Joey said, pulling at my arm. "We should run." But I couldn't move. I was still staring at the spot where the creature had vanished into the forest, half expecting it to emerge again. "Did you see it?" I asked Joey, my voice shaking. "What was it?" "Hairy man," he repeated, as if that explained everything. "Pop says they've always been here. They stay away from people mostly." Before we could decide whether to run or not, Mr. Dawson reached us, red-faced and angry. "What the bloody hell are you boys doing up here?" he demanded. "You're supposed to be in class." "Sir," I blurted out, pointing toward the forest. "There was something down there, a hairy man by the soccer field." Miss Parker arrived then, equally furious. "Ethan Walsh and Joey Jangala, so this is where you've been hiding when you should be doing your schoolwork." "Miss, we saw something," Joey insisted. "A hairy man, like from the stories. It was tall and orange, and—" "That's quite enough," Mr. Dawson cut in. "I expected better from both of you. Making up wild stories won't get you out of trouble." "We're not making it up," I yelled, suddenly angry that they wouldn't listen. "It was there. It was tall as the goalposts and covered in orange hair, and it—" "Ethan!" Miss Parker's voice was sharp. "I don't want to hear another word about this nonsense. You're both coming back to school right now, and the principal will be calling your parents." They marched us back down the hill, lecturing us the whole way about responsibility and telling lies. I kept looking back over my shoulder, scanning the forest edge, but there was nothing there. Back at school, we got sent straight to the principal's office. Mr. Bennett was a stern old guy with bushy eyebrows and little patience for troublemakers. He gave us a long lecture about the importance of attendance and the dangers of leaving school grounds. When we tried to tell him what we'd seen, he just shook his head. "Boys, I understand you're trying to justify your actions, but making up stories about monsters won't help your case." "It wasn't a monster," Joey said quietly. "It was a hairy man. My people know about them." Mr. Bennett's expression softened slightly. "Joey, I respect your culture's stories, but using them as an excuse for skipping school isn't appropriate." We both got detention for a week and notes to take home to our parents. My dad grounded me for a fortnight. Joey never told me what his parents said, but he was quieter after that day. The strangest part came a few days later. Joey's grandfather, the one who told all the stories, showed up at school and asked to speak with Joey and me. The teachers let us sit with him under a tree in the playground during lunch break. "Joey tells me you boys saw something," the old man said without preamble. His face was weathered and lined, his eyes dark and serious. I nodded nervously. "Yes, sir, by the forest." "Tell me exactly what you saw," he said. So I did, describing every detail I could remember. The height, the orange hair, the dark face, the way it moved, everything. Joey added bits I missed, and his grandfather listened without interrupting, his expression giving nothing away. When we finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You boys stay away from that hill, and don't go near the forest alone." "You believe us?" I asked, surprised. He looked at me with those serious eyes. "The hairy men have been here longer than any of us. Mostly they keep to themselves, but sometimes they get curious about our world." "What are they?" I asked. He shook his head. "They're not for knowing too much about. Just respect their space, and they'll respect yours." That was the last time anyone ever talked to me seriously about what we saw. My parents dismissed it as an overactive imagination. The other kids at school teased us for a while about seeing Bigfoot, but eventually they moved on to other things. Joey and I talked about it sometimes, just between ourselves. We never went back to that hill, and I started having nightmares, dreams where I was being watched from the trees by dark eyes, dreams where something large and orange-haired was following me through the bush. I'm 48 now. I've told this story to a few people over the years, usually after a few drinks when conversation turns to weird experiences. Most laugh it off or try to explain it away. A feral person living in the bush, someone in a costume playing a prank, a case of mistaken identity magnified by childish imagination. But Joey and I know what we saw. We've never wavered on the details. Even when we lost touch after high school, I ran into him years later at a pub in Sydney, and the first thing he said after hello was, "I still remember that day on the hill." I often wonder if anyone else has ever seen it. That area's more developed now. The forest has been pushed back for housing estates, and the school has expanded. If there was something living in those woods in 1978, where would it go? Sometimes I think about driving back to my hometown, finding that hill, and just sitting there for a while, watching the tree line, waiting. But then I remember the fear I felt when that creature turned to look at us, and Joey's grandfather's warning, and I decide against it. There are some mysteries better left unexplored, but I know what I saw that autumn day in 1978, and no amount of rational explanation will ever convince me otherwise. Story 7. I've kept this to myself for so long that sometimes I wonder if it even happened. But I know it did. I can still smell the smoke, feel the heat on my face, and see those things running into the flames. It's been over 40 years, but that day in 78 still haunts me. I was a 23-year-old soldier stationed in Queensland. Nothing special about me, just a regular bloke doing his service. That summer was brutally hot, even by Australian standards. We'd had almost no rain for months, and everyone knew it was just a matter of time before the bush went up. When it finally happened in late January, our unit was one of several deployed to help contain the blaze. I'd fought bushfires before, but nothing like this one. The winds were pushing it faster than anyone expected, and it was headed straight for our camp at Mango Hill and several small communities beyond. My mate Dave and I were assigned to the eastern flank, trying to establish a fire break to redirect the spread. I remember the sweat pouring off us in sheets as we worked. My lungs felt like I was breathing in needles with every breath, and my eyes were raw from the smoke. We'd been at it for about 14 hours straight by that point. Exhaustion doesn't even begin to describe it. Your mind starts playing tricks on you when you've been that long without proper rest, surrounded by heat and danger. At least, that's what I tried telling myself afterward. It was late afternoon, maybe around 5 or 6 o'clock. The sun was still up, but partially obscured by this thick wall of smoke that had turned the sky this sickly orange-grey color. Dave and I were taking a quick break, gulping water from our canteens, when he suddenly grabbed my arm. "Max, look over there," he said, pointing toward a densely wooded area about 100 meters to our right. "Someone's coming!" I squinted through the haze. At first I couldn't make anything out, but then I saw movement. Something dark was moving through the trees. Then I realized it was actually two somethings. "What the hell are they doing?" I said, already on my feet. "They're headed straight for the main fire." The fire was jumping from tree to tree about 500 meters ahead of us, and these figures were walking directly toward it. No, not walking. They were moving with purpose, almost jogging. "Hey!" Dave shouted, waving his arms. "Turn back! Turn back!" I joined in, cupping my hands around my mouth. "You can't go that way, the fire's spreading." The figures didn't slow or change direction. They just kept going toward the flames. "Maybe they can't hear us over the fire," Dave said, already starting to move toward them. I grabbed my radio to call it in, but all I got was static. The comms had been spotty all day, due to the fire and the terrain. "Come on," I said. "We need to stop those idiots before they get themselves killed." We started running toward them, which wasn't easy in full gear after 14 hours of firefighting. As we got closer, something started to feel wrong. They were still partially obscured by trees and smoke, but I could tell they were tall, really tall, and they didn't seem to be wearing any protective gear. "They're not wearing shirts," Dave said, slowing his pace slightly. They're not wearing anything." He was right. As we closed the distance to maybe 50 meters, I could see they were completely naked, or appeared to be. Their skin was dark, almost black, but not like aboriginal dark. It was different somehow, and covered in what looked like hair or fur. "What the hell?" I muttered, suddenly hesitant to get any closer. They must have heard us by then, but they didn't turn or acknowledge us in any way. They just kept moving toward the fire with this strange, fluid gait that wasn't quite like normal walking. Dave and I stopped. Something primitive in my brain was screaming at me not to get any closer. The figures were fully visible now, no longer obscured by trees, and I could see they were easily 7 feet tall, maybe taller. Their proportions were all wrong. Arms too long, shoulders too wide, heads sitting directly on those shoulders with barely any neck. "Those aren't people," Dave whispered. His voice snapped me back to reality. "We need to get back to the line," I said, my mouth bone dry despite having just drunk water. That's when one of them stopped and turned. Even from 50 meters away, I could feel it looking at us. I couldn't make out facial features through the smoke and distance, but I knew it was staring right at me. Every hair on my body stood up, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin, despite the oppressive heat. For maybe 5 seconds it just stood there, staring. Then it made this sound, not quite a growl, not quite a huff, but something in between. The other one stopped too, turned, and they both just looked at us. I've been face to face with dangerous animals before. I've had close calls with eastern browns and even a saltwater croc once. But nothing has ever made me feel the kind of primal fear I felt in that moment. Without any signal I could see, they both suddenly turned back toward the fire and started running. Not jogging anymore, but full-on sprinting straight toward the wall of flames. "They're going to burn alive," Dave said, his voice cracking. But something told me they weren't. Something told me the fire wasn't a threat to them. But we were. I grabbed Dave's arm. "We need to go, now." We backed away slowly at first, then turned and ran back toward our position. I glanced over my shoulder just as the two figures reached the edge of the fire. What happened next? I still can't explain it. They didn't stop. They didn't slow down. They ran straight into the flames. We made it back to our position and immediately reported what we'd seen over the radio, which was miraculously working again. The response was predictable. We were told exhaustion and smoke inhalation were making us see things. They sent a small team to check out the area anyway, but of course they found nothing. That night at camp, Dave and I talked about it in hushed voices. We both knew what we'd seen, but we also knew how it sounded. By morning, We'd come to an unspoken agreement not to mention it again, especially after overhearing some of the other guys joking about Max and Dave's smoke monsters. But I couldn't shake what I'd seen. The way they moved, the way they stared at us, the way they ran into the fire without hesitation. A week later, after the fire was finally contained, I was helping with the damage assessment. We were checking an area that had been completely devastated, nothing but blackened trees and ash. I separated from my group to take a piss behind what was left of a large eucalyptus, and that's when I saw it. A footprint, but not a human footprint. It was huge, easily 15 inches long, and shaped wrong, too wide across the toes, which appeared to be more like fingers than human toes. The impression was deep in the ash, like whatever made it was incredibly heavy. I stared at it for a long time, then carefully took out my camera and snapped a photo. I never showed that photo to anyone, never developed the film. It's still in that camera, which is locked in a box in my garage. Some things are better left undocumented. That day changed me. I finished my service, but left the military as soon as my time was up. Moved from Queensland to Victoria to get as far from those northern bushlands as possible. I never told anyone what I saw, not my wife, not my kids, not even Dave after that day. We exchanged Christmas cards for a few years, but eventually lost touch. I wonder sometimes if he thinks about it as much as I do. I've read accounts over the years of similar sightings in the Australian bush. Most people call them yowies, but that doesn't seem right to me. Whatever we saw wasn't some mythical bush spirit. It was flesh and blood, but it wasn't human. And the fire. Why did they run into the fire? That's the question that keeps me up at night, even 40+ years later. Were they immune to it somehow? Were they trying to escape us? Or were they going home? Sometimes when there's bushfire news on TV, my wife notices how I tense up, how I get this distant look in my eyes. She thinks it's PTSD from fighting the fires. She's not entirely wrong, I suppose. I'm old now, retired. I've got grandkids who love hearing Grandpa's adventure stories from his army days. I tell them plenty, but never that one. Never about the day I saw something impossible walk into fire. I don't think anyone would believe me anyway. Hell, sometimes I don't believe myself. But then, I remember the footprint, the way my skin crawled when it looked at me, the sound it made, that huff growl that I still hear in my dreams. I'm writing this now because I don't know how many years I've got left, and I need someone to know what happened that day. I need to know I'm not crazy, that someone else might have seen something similar. So that's my story. Two creatures, not human, running into a bushfire in Queensland in '78. I can't explain it. I can't forget it. And I've never felt safe in the bush since. If you've seen something similar, please let me know. Or maybe it's better if you don't. Some questions are better left unanswered. Some memories are better left buried. But I know what I saw. God help me, I know what I saw. Story 8. I've debated about sharing this for decades, but after stumbling across similar experiences online, I think it's time. This happened in 1978 when I was 22, and it still gives me cold sweats when I think about it. Me and 4 mates from uni in Melbourne had planned this camping trip for weeks. There was me, Andrew, my best mate Dave, his roommate Terry, and 2 other blokes from our engineering course, Mike and Robbie. We weren't hardcore outdoorsmen or anything, just city boys looking to get pissed around a campfire and escape assignments for a weekend. We decided on the Grampians, specifically an area called Scrar, about 1.5 kilometers south of Mount William. It was mid-autumn, chilly, but not freezing yet. Perfect camping weather, we thought. The drive from Melbourne took about 3 hours, with a stop in Ararat for supplies, mostly beer and snags for the barbie. We were young, stupid, and invincible, the usual. We arrived around 2 in the afternoon on Friday. The spot was beautiful. Rugged bushland with these amazing rock formations jutting out everywhere. We found a small clearing that seemed perfect for our tent, enough space for a fire pit and some logs to sit on. Hardly saw another soul out there, which at the time seemed brilliant. Setting up camp took ages because none of us really knew what we were doing. Dave kept saying he'd been camping loads of times as a kid, but it became obvious he was talking out his arse when he couldn't figure out how to set up the tent poles. We spent more time laughing and drinking than actually accomplishing anything. By early evening, we had our camp sorted. One large 6-man tent, a decent fire going, and our esky full of VB keeping cold in the nearby creek. The plan was simple: cook some food, drink, tell bullshit stories, and enjoy being away from lectures and textbooks. Everything was normal at first. We grilled sausages and steak on the portable barbie, told the usual crap jokes, and took turns trying to scare each other with stories about bunyips and drop bears. Standard stuff for 5 dickheads from the city trying to feel outdoorsy. The sun went down fast, and it got properly dark. Not like Melbourne dark with streetlights and buildings, but pitch black except for our fire and the millions of stars above. I remember thinking how bloody quiet it was. No traffic, no neighbors, nothing but the occasional bird or insect and the crackling fire. We stayed up until about midnight, finishing off most of our beer supply and getting progressively louder as the night went on. Nobody thought to keep it down. We were in the middle of nowhere, right? Who were we going to disturb? By the time we crawled into our sleeping bags, we were all pretty drunk and passed out almost immediately. The tent was cramped with 5 of us, but we were tired enough not to care. Then it happened. I was jolted awake by what sounded like a massive branch snapping, not like a twig under a boot, but like someone had taken a bloody tree and cracked it in half. The sound was so loud and sudden that I sat bolt upright, disoriented, and still half drunk. "What the fuck was that?" Terry whispered, obviously awake too. Before I could answer, there was another crack, even louder, followed by a sound I can only describe as wood being torn apart. Then another, and another. It sounded like someone, or something, was destroying trees just north of our campsite. I fumbled for my watch and squinted at it in the darkness. 2:15 in the morning. "Is everyone awake?" I asked. 4 groggy voices confirmed they were. "That's not normal, right?" Mike asked, trying to sound casual but not quite pulling it off. The crashing continued, violent, deliberate sounds of destruction. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a falling branch. Something was actively breaking, twisting and tearing at the trees. "Should we look?" Dave suggested, though he didn't sound eager. Nobody moved at first. Then Terry grabbed the torch we'd left by the tent entrance. "I'm having a squiz. Who's coming?" I wish I could say I bravely volunteered first, but the truth is, none of us wanted to go outside. The noises were getting more frantic. Not just cracking now, but a kind of wrenching sound, like something was being pulled from the ground with tremendous force. "Fuck it," I finally said, grabbing my boots. "Let's all go. Safety in numbers." We all pulled on jackets and shoes in silence, listening to the continued destruction outside. It was a cool night, maybe 10 degrees, and I remember my hands shaking as I tied my laces. Not from the cold. Terry unzipped the tent flap slowly, as if whatever was making the noise might hear the zipper and come charging. The torchlight cut through the darkness, casting long shadows across our campsite. The fire had died down to glowing embers, giving off just enough light to see the immediate area around our tent. We stepped out one by one. I'd never heard silence quite like what fell between the crashing sounds. No insects, no nightbirds. Nothing, as if everything in the bush was holding its breath. The noises were coming from beyond a ridge of thick scrub to the north, maybe 500 meters away. Terry swept the torch in that direction, but the beam couldn't penetrate the dense vegetation. "Hello?" Dave called out, his voice sounding pathetically small in the vastness of the dark bush. The crashing stopped abruptly. Complete silence followed. We all froze, barely breathing. Then we heard it. Movement through the scrub. Not like a wallaby or a wombat. This was large, deliberate movement. Branches and undergrowth being pushed aside. Something big was moving toward us. Shit, 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 Robbie muttered beside me. The torchlight revealed nothing but shadows and trees, but the sounds were unmistakable. Something was out there, coming closer, then stopping, then moving again, almost like it was stalking us. "Is it a person?" Mike whispered. "Like a ranger or something?" I shook my head. Who the fuck would be out here at 2 in the morning pulling up trees? "Maybe someone's camping nearby and getting firewood," Dave suggested, but his voice cracked. Another crash, closer now. Then a sound I'll never forget, a low rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath our feet. Not a dog. Not any animal I recognized. It was deep, primal, and made every hair on my body stand straight up. Terry's hand was shaking so badly, the torchlight danced erratically across the tree line. "I'm not going any closer," he said. None of us argued. Whatever was out there was powerful enough to tear up small trees and made sounds no human could produce. "Let's get back in the tent," I said, trying to sound calm but failing miserably. "The tent?" Robbie hissed. "That's just canvas. If that thing decides to come here, then we're fucked wherever we are," I cut him off. "At least in the tent we're together." We backed up slowly toward our camp, eyes fixed on the darkness where the sounds were coming from. Just as we reached the tent, we heard more movement in the scrub, this time moving away from us. The 5 of us huddled in the tent, nobody suggesting we try to sleep. We kept the torch on, pointed at the tent entrance, listening to the occasional distant crack and rustle for what felt like hours. I checked my watch compulsively, 2:30, 2:45, 3:20. "What if it's a person messing with us?" Terry suggested at one point. "You didn't hear that growl," Dave replied. "That wasn't human." "Could be a bear," Mike said. "There aren't any fucking bears in Australia, you idiot," Robbie snapped. "A feral pig, maybe," I offered, not believing it myself. We debated in whispers. Feral pigs, escaped zoo animals, even bunyips, anything to rationalize what we'd heard. But deep down, I think we all knew this was something else entirely. Somewhere around 4 in the morning, exhaustion won out, and we dozed fitfully until the first light of dawn filtered through the tent walls. None of us was eager to go outside, but daylight brought back some courage. We emerged cautiously into the grey morning light, half expecting to see our campsite destroyed. Everything looked normal, our gear untouched, the fire pit cold, morning dew on everything. "Maybe we overreacted," Mike suggested hopefully, but I couldn't shake the memory of those sounds, the cracking, the growling, the heavy movement through the scrub. "Let's check it out," Dave said, pointing north where the noises had come from. We followed him reluctantly, nobody wanting to go first through the thick scrub. The morning was eerily quiet, except for a few magpies and our boots crunching on fallen leaves. About 300 meters from our camp, we started to see the evidence. It's hard to describe the destruction without sounding like I'm exaggerating. Small saplings, eucalypts and wattles about as thick as my arm, had been twisted, literally twisted until they snapped, not cut clean like with an axe or saw, twisted and torn, with the wood fibers splayed out like frayed rope ends. "Jesus Christ," Terry whispered. Some had been completely wrenched from the ground, roots and all. The soil around them was torn up, exposing dark earth. But the most disturbing thing was the roots themselves. They appeared to have been chewed, not cleanly cut, but gnawed and bitten off in various spots. There were no teeth marks I could clearly identify, just mangled, shredded root ends. "No animal does this," Robbie said, kneeling to examine one of the uprooted saplings. "It would take incredible strength." "A storm?" Mike suggested weakly. We all looked at him. There hadn't been a breath of wind all night. "What about the growl?" Dave asked. "We all heard it. I noticed something else." a faint, musky smell hung in the air around the destroyed trees. Not like anything I could identify, not completely animal, but definitely organic, pungent and strange. We found more destroyed vegetation as we moved further north. About 20 trees in total had been damaged or completely uprooted. The path of destruction seemed random, not like a trail or clearing, just mindless, powerful damage. "I want to leave," Terry said suddenly. "Now." For once, nobody argued. We returned to camp in silence, each lost in our thoughts. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something watching us from the scrub. We packed up in record time, barely speaking, except to coordinate who was carrying what. Nobody mentioned staying another night as originally planned. Nobody suggested exploring further or trying to find rational explanations. We just wanted out. The drive back to Melbourne was tense and quiet. Eventually, Dave broke the silence. "We should report it to someone. The rangers, maybe?" "And say what?" Mike countered. "That we heard noises and found some damaged trees. They'll think we did it ourselves. Or that we were drunk and imagined things," Robbie added. I stayed quiet, replaying the sounds in my head, the cracking, the growling, the heavy movement through the scrub. I couldn't reconcile it with anything I knew existed in the Australian bush. Back in Melbourne, we gradually stopped talking about it. When others asked about our camping trip, we'd just say it was all right, or too cold, or some other bullshit. I think we all felt that saying it out loud would make us sound crazy. Or worse, make it more real. I never went camping again after that. Not once in the 40-plus years since. The others might have. We drifted apart after university, as people do. Sometimes I wonder if they remember that night as vividly as I do, or if they've convinced themselves it was nothing. I've researched over the years. Cryptozoology, indigenous legends, documented phenomena in the Grampians. I found stories of hairy men in Aboriginal folklore, accounts from early settlers about strange creatures in the bush. I've even read about yowies, Australia's version of Bigfoot. But I've never found an explanation that fully fits what we experienced. All I know is this: something was out there that night. Something powerful enough to tear saplings from the ground. Something that moved with purpose and made sounds no known Australian animal makes. And sometimes, when I wake up at 2 in the morning for no reason, I can still hear that deep rumbling growl that seemed to come from the earth itself. I don't expect anyone to believe me. I'm not sure I would believe it myself if I hadn't been there, but it happened exactly as I've described it. And to this day, when people talk about camping in the Grampians, I find myself warning them, stay away from Mount William, especially at night. Some things in this world aren't meant to be encountered, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. Story 9. I've never told this story outside my family and closest mates. Even now, 44 years later, I still wake up in cold sweats when I hear certain sounds at night. What happened that summer in '79 changed me forever, and I'm still not sure what to make of it. It was the summer of 1979 in New South Wales. Me, my cousin Darren, and our mates Pete and Mick decided to go for a proper bush camping and fishing trip. The kind where you really get away from everything. I was 22 then, young and stupid, thinking we were invincible like most blokes that age. We found this perfect spot along the Shoalhaven River, about 3 hours southwest of Sydney. Remote, quiet, no other campers for miles, just the way we wanted it. We'd been planning this trip for months, saving up for gear and supplies. I remember packing my dad's old canvas tent, some basic cooking gear, and enough tinnies to keep us happy for the week. The plan was simple: fish, hunt, drink, and disconnect from the world. The first couple of days were exactly what we hoped for. Caught some decent fish, set up a proper camp with a fire pit, even managed to keep the mosquitoes mostly at bay. The weather was perfect. Warm days, cool nights. We were living like kings out there, or so we thought. On the third day, we decided to explore further downriver to set more fishing lines and yabby traps. That's when things started getting weird. We were about a kilometer from camp when this smell hit us. Not just any smell, the kind that makes your stomach turn inside out, like rotten eggs mixed with decaying meat and sewage. So intense it burned my nostrils. "Jesus Christ," Pete gagged. "What the hell is that?" I remember Mick pulling his shirt over his nose. Probably a dead roo or something. But we couldn't find any carcass. The smell seemed to hang in the air around this one particular bend in the river, concentrated in an area maybe 30 meters wide. We hurried to set our lines and traps, barely able to breathe through the stench. "Let's get out of here," Darren said, looking uneasy. "We can check the lines later." We practically ran back to camp, all of us retching and spitting. The weird thing was, the smell disappeared completely once we left that spot, like it had a boundary, not fading gradually like normal odors, just there one moment, gone the next. Later that afternoon, we decided to head back to check our lines. I remember being nervous about the smell, but when we got there, it was completely gone, not even a trace. We looked at each other, confused. "Maybe it was a dead animal that got washed away," Mick suggested, but none of us were convinced. Something about it felt off. Our lines had caught a couple decent-sized fish, which lifted our spirits. On the way back to camp, Mick and Pete spotted a kangaroo and decided they wanted to try hunting. They'd brought a rifle for this very purpose. I wasn't keen on it, but they were determined. They tracked and shot a female roo, and when they went to collect it, they found a joey in her pouch. I still remember Pete holding up this tiny, helpless thing. "Can't just leave it to die," he said, his face softening. So they put the little joey in a canvas bag with some leaves and tied it to a tree about 5 meters from our tents. The plan was to take it to a wildlife center when we left in 2 days. That evening, Mick, Pete, and Darren wanted to go spotlighting for rabbits. I was knackered from the day and decided to stay back at camp. I wasn't much for hunting anyway. "Don't drink all the beer while we're gone," Darren joked as they headed off with the rifle and torch. I remember sitting by the fire after they left, feeling completely at peace. The sun had set, and the only light came from the flames and the half-moon above. The river made gentle rushing sounds nearby. I could hear the joey making little grunting noises from its bag. I checked on it once, making sure it was comfortable, then went back to the fire. Around 9, I decided to turn in. I crawled into my tent, zipped up the mosquito netting, and laid back on my sleeping bag. I must have dozed off pretty quickly. I don't know exactly what time it was when I woke up. The fire had died down to embers, casting a dull red glow over the campsite. What woke me was a crashing sound downriver, like something large moving through the underbrush. At first, I thought it might be the boys coming back, but they'd gone in the opposite direction. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps moving through the bush toward camp. Not like a kangaroo's hop or a wombat's waddle. These were bipedal, 2 feet walking, but much heavier than a human's tread. Each step made the ground vibrate slightly. I froze in my sleeping bag, suddenly wide awake, my heart hammering against my ribs. Whatever was coming was big, really big, and it was coming straight for our camp. The footsteps slowed as they approached. I could hear branches snapping, leaves crunching, then silence. It had stopped moving. I held my breath, straining to hear over the blood pounding in my ears. For a moment, I convinced myself it had gone away. Then the joey started making noise, those little grunts and mewls from inside its bag. And what happened next still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. Whatever was out there started to mimic the joey. Not just random animal sounds, it was copying the exact pitch and rhythm of the joey's calls. A perfect imitation, but coming from something much, much larger. The sound came from about man height, not from the ground where you'd expect a wild dog or other predator. I was paralyzed with fear. My tent suddenly felt like tissue paper. No protection at all. I couldn't see what was out there because of the tent walls, but I could track its movements by sound. It was circling the camp slowly, still occasionally mimicking the joey's sounds. Then it approached my tent. I could feel its presence just outside the thin canvas. It was so close I could hear it breathing, deep, wet breaths that sounded almost like a large animal panting, but with an odd, almost human-like rhythm to it. It paused there for what felt like hours, but was probably just seconds. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I was certain that any movement would provoke it. Then, to my relief and horror, it moved away from my tent, toward the tree where we'd hung the joey's bag. The little joey was making distressed sounds now, as if it sensed the danger. I heard the creature reach the tree, and then the whole thing began to shake. I could hear it pulling at the bag, grunting with effort. The tree, a solid eucalyptus about 20 centimeters thick, was shaking like it was in a windstorm. The creature made sounds of frustration. Not quite words, but not like any animal I'd ever heard either. Guttural, deep vocalizations that seemed to convey anger and determination. The bag must have been tied too securely, because after about a minute of this, the creature let out a sound I'll never forget as long as I live. It wasn't a roar like a lion or a bear. It was more like a combination of a scream and a growl, but impossibly loud. Loud enough that I felt it in my chest cavity. It was a sound of pure rage that echoed through the valley. Birds erupted from trees in the distance. Then silence for a few seconds, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps moving away from camp. I lay there, shaking, for what must have been 15 minutes, afraid to move or make a sound. Just as my breathing started to return to normal, I heard something else, the sounds of a violent confrontation in the bush maybe 100 meters from camp. Snarling, crashing, the splintering of wood, and those same guttural vocalizations, but now mixed with the sounds of some other animal. There was a final pained yelp, like a dog or dingo, and then silence again. I didn't sleep a wink the rest of the night. I just lay there, my hunting knife clutched in my hand, waiting for dawn or for the creature to return. The boys came back around midnight, and I frantically shushed them as they approached camp, whispering for them to get in their tents immediately. They thought I was pulling their leg until they saw the state I was in, white as a ghost and shaking. They knew I wasn't one for practical jokes. "What happened?" Darren whispered once they were all crouched in my tent. I told them everything, my voice breaking. They listened in silence, exchanging glances. "Probably a big roo," Mick suggested, but without conviction. "No chance," I said. "This walked on two legs, and it mimicked the joey. No roo does that." We decided to pack up and leave at first light. None of us said it, but we were all thinking the same thing. We weren't welcome here anymore. As dawn broke, we started gathering our gear as quietly as possible. The joey was still in its bag, seemingly untouched but distressed. The tree it hung from had deep gouges in the bark that none of us wanted to examine too closely. Darren volunteered to take the boat downriver to retrieve our fishing lines and traps. We needed all our gear if we were leaving. I watched him row away with my heart in my throat, praying that whatever had visited in the night was long gone. 20 minutes later, Darren came rowing back at a speed I didn't think possible with those old oars. He beached the boat awkwardly and stumbled onto shore, his face ashen. He was trembling so badly he could barely speak. "What happened?" Pete grabbed his shoulders to steady him. Darren gulped air, his eyes wild. "I saw it," he whispered. "Down by the last fishing line. It was watching me from the tree line." We all went silent. "What was it?" I finally asked, already knowing it was what had come to camp in the night. "Massive, covered in black hair, standing upright." Darren's voice was barely audible. "It had a face, almost like a person's, but not. And teeth. I saw its teeth when it..." He trailed off. "When it what?" Mick pressed. "When it smiled at me." Darren looked up, his eyes haunted. It fucking smiled at me. We abandoned most of our gear, grabbed only what we could carry quickly, threw it in the car, and drove out of there with the wheels spinning dirt. We took the Joey to a wildlife station along the way. None of us spoke much during the drive back to Sydney. We all tried to rationalize what happened in the following weeks. A large, escaped ape, a man living wild in the bush. But deep down, we knew better. Whatever was in those woods wasn't anything science has a name for. I've never been camping since. Not once in 44 years. Darren neither. Pete and Mick eventually went back to the outdoors, but never to that river. Sometimes when I catch a whiff of sulfur or hear something heavy moving outside my house at night, I'm right back in that tent, listening to that thing, mimicking the Joey's cries, trying to lure it out. I still don't know what it was, but I know it's still out there, somewhere in the bush, waiting for someone else to invade its territory. And God help them when they do. Story 10. I still get a sick feeling in my stomach when I think about that weekend in April '79. I was just 17 then, full of that stupid teenage confidence where you think nothing bad can touch you. My mate Len was a bit older, 24, and supposedly the responsible one between us, though that didn't count for much when it mattered. It was meant to be just a simple camping trip, something we'd done countless times before in the bush around New South Wales. Len had this beat-up old Holden that could handle the dirt roads, and we'd packed it with our gear on Friday afternoon. Tent, sleeping bags, a small cooler with beer and meat for the barbie, and my .22 rifle. I'd brought the rifle mainly for shooting rabbits. Never thought I'd be pointing it at, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. We headed out toward Nunis, not much more than a ghost town these days. The appeal was that hardly anyone went out there anymore. No rangers hassling you about permits, no other campers playing music till all hours. Just pure wilderness and quiet. We took this dirt track deep into the forest until even Len wasn't sure exactly where we were. The road narrowed to barely wider than the car in some spots, branches scraping against the windows as we pushed further in. "This'll do," Len finally said around sunset, pulling over to a small clearing just off the track. It wasn't anything special, just a flat patch of ground with enough space for the tent and a fire pit someone had made of stones a while back. The bush was thick all around us, eucalypts and scrubby undergrowth stretching in every direction. If you stood quiet, you couldn't hear anything but birds and the whisper of leaves. We set up camp quickly while there was still light, got a fire going, and cracked open a few beers. The night was clear, one of those spectacular country skies where you can see every star in the galaxy. We cooked some sausages on the portable grill, bullshitted about girls and cars, and whatever else seemed important back then. "Heard they spotted a panther out here last month," Len said at one point, poking the fire with a stick. "Bullshit," I laughed. "People are always seeing panthers in the bush. It's just feral cats grown big." Nah, this was the real deal. Farmer lost 3 sheep in one night. Said the tracks were massive. I didn't think much of it. Australia's full of stories like that. Big cats escaped from circuses generations ago, breeding in the wilderness. Never any proof, though. We turned in around midnight. The tent was small, barely fitting the 2 of us, but we were tired enough not to care. Between the beers and the long drive, I fell asleep almost immediately, listening to the normal bush sounds. Crickets, the occasional rustle as something small moved through the undergrowth, Len's soft snoring beside me. I don't know exactly what time it was when I first heard it. The luminous dial on my watch had stopped working months ago, and I'd never bothered getting it fixed. But it was the dead of night, that special kind of darkness that feels like it'll never end. What woke me wasn't loud exactly, more like wrong, out of place. At first I thought it might be a dingo. They make these eerie howling sounds sometimes that can freeze your blood if you're not expecting it. But this wasn't that, it was higher pitched, almost like someone trying to imitate a bird call but getting it horribly wrong. A long, wavering wail that rose and fell, echoing through the trees. I lay there frozen, waiting for it to stop. Instead, it came again, closer this time. Then again. Not moving away like an animal would, but circling, pacing around our camp. "Len," I whispered, jabbing him with my elbow. "Wake up." He grunted and rolled over. "Len, listen." The sound came again. This time, Len sat bolt upright, his sleeping bag falling to his waist. "What the fuck is that?" he hissed. "Dunno. Thought maybe you'd know." We sat in silence, straining to hear. The wailing had stopped, but now there was something else. A heavy rustling from the direction of the car, like something large moving through the undergrowth, not careful either, but confident, unhurried. "Probably just a roo," Len said, but his voice had that tight quality that told me he didn't believe it. "Big fucking roo," I muttered. The rustling stopped. Then there was a new sound, a deep rumbling growl that was nothing like any animal I'd ever heard. Not like a dog or a cat. Almost human in its tone, but impossibly deep, like it was coming from something with a chest twice the size of a man's. "We should check it out," Len said, reaching for the torch beside his sleeping bag. "Are you mental?" I grabbed his arm. "Whatever's out there sounds big. Could be someone mucking around, trying to scare us." But even as he said it, we both knew that made no sense. We were kilometers from anywhere, on a track hardly anyone used. The growl came again, followed by the snap of a branch breaking underfoot. Close now. Very close. "Fuck this," Len muttered, unzipping the tent flap. "I'm not sitting here waiting for it." I followed him, grabbing my own torch and, as an afterthought, my rifle. The night air hit me like a slap, colder than it had been when we turned in. Must have been around 3 in the morning, that dead time when everything feels unreal. Our fire had burned down to embers, casting just enough dull red light to see the immediate clearing, but nothing beyond. Len swept his torch beam across the trees at the edge of our sight, the yellow light cutting through the darkness like a knife. "See anything?" I whispered, my voice sounding too loud in the silence that had fallen. "Nah. Maybe it..." He stopped, his torch beam freezing on a spot about 20 meters away, just beyond where our car was parked. "Tom," he said, his voice gone strange and tight. "Look." I pointed my torch in the same direction, and that's when I saw it. Crouched low among the trees was something. Something big and dark and covered in what looked like hair or fur. From the way it was positioned, it seemed to be examining our car, one massive hand, at least it looked like a hand, resting on the bonnet. "What the fuck is that?" I breathed, my finger instinctively finding the trigger of my rifle. The creature didn't move, seemingly frozen in the cross of our torch beams. In the poor light, I couldn't make out details, just the general shape. Bulky, powerful, vaguely human in its proportions, but all wrong in the specifics. Its head looked too small for its body, and the shoulders were impossibly broad. Then it turned its face toward us, and I felt my stomach drop somewhere around my ankles. I couldn't see features, just dark hollows where eyes should be, reflecting our torchlight with a dull red gleam. "Holy shit," Len whispered. "Is that a..." He never finished the sentence. In one fluid motion, I raised my rifle and pointed it at the thing. It was pure instinct, my hands moving before my brain had fully processed what I was seeing. The click of the safety coming off sounded obscenely loud. That's when it stood up. God, I'll never forget that moment. It just kept rising, unfolding itself from its crouched position until it towered among the trees. 7 feet tall at minimum, probably more. Its arms hung long at its sides, reaching almost to its knees, and its chest was barrel wide. For one impossible second, we all just froze. Len and me with our torches and my gun pointed at this thing, and it standing there staring back at us with those reflective eyes. Then it moved. Not toward us, thank Christ, but away, turning with surprising grace for something so large and plunging into the bush. The sound of it crashing through the undergrowth was like nothing I'd ever heard. Branches snapping, bushes being flattened, all at a speed that something that size shouldn't have been capable of. "What the fuck, what the fuck, what the fuck?" Len was saying, his torch beam jerking wildly as he tried to follow its movement. But it was gone, swallowed by the darkness and the trees. I stood there, rifle still raised, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might crack my ribs. My hands were shaking so badly that even if the thing had stayed put, I doubt I could have hit it. "Did you see that?" Len's voice was high, almost hysterical. "Did you fucking see that?" "Yeah," I managed to croak out. My mouth had gone bone dry. "I saw it." "What was it? A bear? Do we have bears in Australia?" "No bears in Australia, mate." My brain was scrambling to make sense of what we'd just witnessed. It wasn't a bear. Well, it wasn't a fucking kangaroo. We stood there in the dark, torches sweeping the tree line, straining to hear any sound of its return. But there was nothing now except the normal bush noises, which somehow made it worse. Like we'd imagined the whole thing. "Let's get back in the tent," I finally said, though the thin nylon suddenly seemed like pathetically inadequate protection. "Fuck that. Let's get in the car. Lock the doors." It was the sensible option, but something made me hesitate. What if it comes back while we're moving our stuff? We don't know what that thing was or what it wants. "I don't care what it wants. Did you see the size of it?" We argued in whispers for another minute before deciding to compromise. We'd grab our sleeping bags from the tent and spend the rest of the night in the car. Neither of us was keen to start packing up camp in the dark with that thing potentially still nearby. The few meters to the tent felt like crossing a minefield. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle in the bush sounded like footsteps. We grabbed our sleeping bags and a few essentials, then made a dash for the car. Len fumbled with the keys, swearing under his breath until the locks finally clicked open. Inside the Holden, doors locked and windows up, we sat in silence for a long time. The windscreen was fogged from our breathing, limiting visibility even further. Every few minutes, one of us would wipe a clear spot and shine a torch out, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. "We should leave," Len said, after what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. "First light, we pack up and get the hell out of here." I nodded, though the thought of getting out of the car to take down the tent made my stomach clench. "What do you think it was?" Len shook his head. "No idea. Too big for any normal animal. Wrong shape for a human. Could be someone in a costume, trying to scare campers." Even as I said it, I knew it was bollocks. The way it moved was too natural, too fluid for someone in a suit. And who would go to that trouble out here, kilometers from anywhere, on the off chance some campers might show up? "Maybe it's one of those yowies people talk about," Len said quietly. "You know, like Australia's version of Bigfoot or whatever." I'd heard the stories, of course. Everyone in rural Australia has. Aboriginal legends about hairy men in the bush, modern sightings of ape-like creatures in remote areas. I'd always written them off as campfire tales, the same category as panthers and bunyips. Now, I wasn't so sure. "If that's what it was, we're lucky it ran off," I said. "Stories I've heard, they're not usually shy." We fell silent again, both lost in our own thoughts. Sleep was out of the question. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing rising to its full height, those reflective eyes turning toward us. The hours crawled by. Occasionally we'd hear something moving in the bush, normal wildlife probably, but each sound sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through me. My rifle lay across my lap, loaded and ready, though what good a .22 would do against something that size, I didn't want to find out. As the first hint of dawn lightened the sky, we finally relaxed slightly. Whatever it was seemed to have moved on, and with daylight coming, we felt safer. "Let's pack up and go," Len said, stifling a yawn. Neither of us had slept a wink. We got out cautiously, scanning the surrounding bush. In the grey half-light, everything looked normal. Our tent stood undisturbed, the dead campfire a circle of ash. If not for the shared experience of the night, I might have convinced myself I'd dreamed the whole thing. Then Len called me over to the car. "Look at this," he said, pointing at the bonnet. Where the creature had rested its hand was a distinct mark in the dust and morning dew, a massive handprint, clearly visible. 5 fingers, opposable thumb, but huge. Twice the size of my own hand at least, and pressed into the metal underneath, barely noticeable, but definitely there, were 5 small dents. Like whatever had placed its hand there had been strong enough to slightly buckle the metal with just its weight. "Jesus," I breathed. "That's not human." "No shit." Len was already throwing our gear haphazardly into the back seat. "Let's get out of here before it decides to come back." We broke camp in record time, not bothering to pack things neatly. The tent was still damp with dew, but we just stuffed it in its bag and threw it in with everything else. Within 15 minutes, we were in the car, Len gunning the engine like we were in a getaway movie. As we bounced down the dirt track, I kept looking back, half expecting to see that massive shape emerge from the trees and chase after us. But there was nothing, just the dust cloud we were kicking up and the green wall of the bush. Neither of us spoke much on the drive home. What was there to say? We'd seen something impossible, something that shouldn't exist in the rational world of 1979 Australia. Yet we both knew what we'd witnessed was real. When we hit the main road, Len finally broke the silence. "We're not telling anyone about this." I looked at him surprised. "Why not?" "Because they'll think we're nuts, that's why. Or that we were drunk or high or something." He gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Besides, who'd believe us anyway?" He had a point. Even now, over 40 years later, I struggle to believe it myself sometimes. But then I remember those eyes reflecting our torchlight, that impossible silhouette unfolding to its full height among the trees, and I know what I saw. We never went camping in that area again. Len and I drifted apart a few years later, normal life stuff, jobs and marriages pulling us in different directions. But every so often, I'll read about a strange sighting in the Australian bush, some hiker or camper reporting a massive hairy creature, and I'll wonder if it's the same thing we encountered that night. I still have the rifle. Never used it much after that trip. Sometimes I take it out and clean it, remembering how close I came to firing at something science says doesn't exist. And I wonder what would have happened if I had. Would anyone have believed us then, with a body as proof? Or would it have been even worse somehow? All I know is that the Australian bush is older and wilder than most people realize, and there are things living in its depths that don't appear in any biology textbook. I've seen one of them with my own eyes, and not a day goes by that I don't think about those moments when our world collided with something that shouldn't exist. I've never gone back to those woods near Nunes. Never will. Some mysteries are better left alone in the dark. Story 11. I've never been one to believe in monsters or cryptids or whatever you want to call them. Growing up in rural Australia, I was always taught to respect the bush, but never to fear it. I knew about drop bears and bunyips, the stories parents tell their kids to keep them from wandering off, but I never took them seriously. What happened to me in 1979 changed everything I thought I knew about our wilderness. I was 23 back then, living about 30 kilometers from the Blue Mountains. I'd been riding horses since I was 6 years old, and my gelding Thunder was as reliable as they come. He was an 8-year-old chestnut quarter horse, steady as a rock. I'd had him for 3 years, and in all that time, he had never spooked at anything, not even when a red-bellied black snake crossed our path once. That's why what happened that day in May still gives me chills. It was a Tuesday morning, unseasonably warm for autumn. I remember because I dressed in layers expecting it to be cooler, only to end up tying my jacket around my waist about an hour into our ride. I'd taken the day off from my job at the local pharmacy to go for a trail ride in the Gross Valley Lookout area. It's a beautiful spot. Dense eucalyptus forests, stunning valley views, and usually pretty quiet during weekdays. I packed some sandwiches, filled my canteen, and trailered Thunder out to the parking area around 9 that morning. The plan was to ride down to Little Blue Gum Forest and back, maybe stop for lunch at one of the lookout points. It should have been just another pleasant day on the trails I'd ridden dozens of times before. Everything started normally. The track from the parking area winds along the ridge for about 2 kilometers before beginning the steep descent down to the valley floor. Thunder was in good spirits, ears forward, moving at a relaxed walk as we made our way along the ridge. There were a few other cars in the car park when I arrived, but I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail yet. That wasn't unusual. The area has multiple trails branching off in different directions. It was around 11 when we started down the steep section of track that leads to Gross Valley Lookout. The trail narrows there, with thick bush on both sides, mostly eucalyptus trees, ferns, and that dense undergrowth that's almost impossible to walk through. The lookout itself is a rocky outcropping that gives you a view across the entire valley, and the trail continues past it down to Little Blue Gum Forest. We were about halfway down this section, with the lookout still a few hundred meters ahead, when I first noticed something wasn't right. Thunder's ears suddenly pricked up and swiveled backward. He stopped without me asking, which was unusual. At first, I thought maybe he'd heard another rider coming up the trail behind us, so I turned in the saddle to look. There was nobody there, just the empty trail winding back up through the trees. That's when I heard it. Heavy footsteps moving through the bush about 100 meters off the trail to our right. Not the light rustling of a wallaby or even the distinctive sound of a wild pig. These were heavy, deliberate footsteps, like something large walking on 2 legs. I pulled Thunder to a complete stop and listened. The footsteps paused too, as if whatever was making them had also stopped to listen. For a few seconds, there was complete silence, not even bird calls, which I only realized afterward was strange in itself. "Hello?" I called out, thinking it might be a hiker who'd wandered off the trail. My voice sounded small in the vastness of the bush. No one answered. Thunder shifted underneath me, blowing air through his nostrils. I could feel tension building in his body, something I'd never experienced with him before. Then the footsteps started again, but now they were moving toward us through the scrub. That's when Thunder changed. In an instant, this horse that had never spooked at anything began trembling beneath me. His nostrils flared wide, and he started sniffing the air frantically. I could feel his heart pounding, and sweat broke out across his neck and shoulders almost immediately. Not exertion sweat, but fear sweat. Horse people know the difference. The footsteps were getting closer, and with each one, I could hear branches snapping and undergrowth being crushed. Whatever this was, it was big and moving directly toward us, with purpose. Thunder spun around so quickly I nearly lost my seat. His eyes were showing white all around, and he was making this high-pitched whinnying sound I'd never heard from him before. I tried to calm him, but he was beyond listening. Every instinct in his body was screaming danger in a way I'd never seen in an experienced trail horse. I'd like to say I was brave enough to stay and see what was coming through those trees, but the truth is, Thunder made that decision for both of us. He wheeled around and bolted back up the trail, and it took everything I had just to stay on and guide him around the sharper turns. I wasn't even trying to stop him. His panic had become my panic. Something primal in me recognized that my horse was reacting to a threat beyond what any normal wildlife would trigger. After about 500 meters of flat-out galloping uphill, no small feat, Thunder finally slowed enough for me to regain control. We stopped at a wider section of the trail, both of us breathing hard. I turned in the saddle to look back the way we'd come, half expecting to see something emerging from the bush onto the trail. There was nothing visible, but I could still hear distant movement in the undergrowth. I sat there for maybe 10 minutes, trying to calm Thunder and myself. He remained agitated, ears swiveling in all directions, muscles tense, ready to bolt again at the slightest provocation. I stroked his neck and spoke to him softly, but his eyes kept returning to the trail behind us. Part of me wanted to dismiss the whole thing. Maybe it was a feral pig or even a lost cow from one of the properties that bordered the national park. But I knew horses, and I knew Thunder. In 3 years, I'd seen him encounter snakes, wild dogs, and even a particularly aggressive kangaroo without batting an eye. Whatever had been moving toward us in the bush had terrified him in a way I'd never witnessed. After we both calmed down a bit, I decided to head back to the trailer. There was no way Thunder was going any farther down that trail, and I didn't fancy being thrown if he spooked again. As we made our way back, I kept turning to look behind us, but there was nothing to see. When we reached the parking area, there were a couple more cars than before. An older couple was preparing for a hike, and seeing them gave me a sense of normalcy that I desperately needed. I loaded Thunder into the trailer, but instead of leaving, I found myself drawn back to that trail. I needed to understand what had happened. I decided I would go back on foot, just to the point where we'd heard the footsteps, no farther. I told the hiking couple I was going for a short walk and would be back in half an hour. Looking back, it was probably stupid to go alone, but curiosity was overriding my fear by that point. The walk back down the trail felt different on foot, more vulnerable. Every rustle in the bush made me jump. When I reached the approximate spot where we'd first heard the footsteps, I stopped and listened. The forest seemed normal again, birds calling, insects buzzing, the occasional rustle of a small animal in the undergrowth. I ventured a few meters off the trail in the direction where we'd heard the footsteps, but the bush was thick and difficult to navigate. I couldn't see any obvious signs of disturbance, no broken branches at human height, no clear trail through the undergrowth. After about 10 minutes of searching, I gave up and headed back to the parking area, telling myself I'd overreacted. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching us, something that didn't belong in these woods. For days afterward, I tried to rationalize what had happened. I even called the National Parks Office to ask if there had been any reports of unusual wildlife in the area. The ranger I spoke to mentioned some wild dog sightings, but nothing that would explain what we'd experienced. About a week later, I was at the local pub when I overheard a group of mountain bikers talking about something they'd found near Gross Valley. I wasn't eavesdropping intentionally, but when I heard them mention massive footprints, my blood ran cold. I introduced myself and asked what they were talking about. They were initially reluctant, probably thought I was some crazy cryptid hunter. But when I told them about my experience with Thunder, they opened up. They'd been riding the trails near Little Blue Gum Forest after some rain and found a series of footprints in a muddy section just off the main track. At first, they thought someone was playing a prank, but the prints were deeply embedded in the mud, suggesting whatever made them was extremely heavy. One of the guys had taken photos on his camera. He was hesitant to show me at first, but his friends encouraged him. When he finally dug the developed pictures out of his backpack, my hands were actually shaking as I took them. The prints were unmistakably foot-shaped, 5 toes, an arch, a heel. But they were massive, easily twice the size of a normal human footprint. What struck me most wasn't just the size, but the depth of the impressions. It would take something incredibly heavy to sink that far into even muddy ground. I asked if I could get copies of the photos, but they weren't keen. I think they were worried about being ridiculed. Instead, one of them drew a rough outline of the print on a beer coaster with measurements. According to their estimates, it was around 40 centimeters long and 20 centimeters wide at the ball of the foot. I still have that beer coaster. I've shown it to a few trusted friends over the years, but most people just laugh it off. Australia doesn't have a tradition of Bigfoot or Sasquatch sightings like North America does. We have the Yowie in Aboriginal folklore, but it's not commonly discussed or taken seriously in mainstream culture. But I know what my horse felt that day. I know the fear that ran through both of us wasn't caused by any normal forest animal. Thunder was an experienced trail horse who had encountered every native animal without concern. Yet something in those woods terrified him to his core. For months afterward, I couldn't bring myself to ride in that area again. When I finally did return the following summer, it was with a group of friends. Nothing unusual happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched whenever we rode near Gross Valley Lookout. I've spent years trying to find a logical explanation for what happened that day. The rational part of my brain wants to dismiss it as a feral animal or even another hiker moving parallel to the trail. But then I remember Thunder's reaction, that instantaneous, uncontrollable terror that overcame an otherwise bomb-proof horse. And I think about those footprints the mountain bikers found. Too big for a human, too shaped for any known animal. I'm 44 years older now, and I've never had another experience like it. I still ride, though Thunder has been gone for many years. Sometimes when I'm on the trails, I remember that day, and I find myself scanning the bush, listening for heavy footsteps. The bush doesn't seem as familiar as it once did. There are shadows between the trees that seem deeper, places where the sunlight doesn't quite reach. I don't know what was moving through the bush toward us that day in May 1979. I don't know what left those enormous footprints in the mud near Little Blue Gum Forest, but I know that my horse sensed something that filled him with a primal terror I'd never seen before or since. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the quiet of the evening, I wonder if it's still out there, moving silently through the Australian bush, leaving traces that are discovered and then dismissed, forgotten, or explained away. Because some things are easier to dismiss than to believe. Sometimes the explanation is more frightening than the mystery. Story 12. It was June of 1979, and I've been replaying that day in my head ever since. I was working on a renovation project in a small town outside Melbourne at the time. The weather had been unusually dry that winter, and we'd finished up earlier than expected that Friday. My colleague, Bom Durari, we all just called him Bom, had already headed back to town to sort out some supplies for Monday, and I decided to take advantage of the remaining daylight. I'd always been fond of bushwalking, and there was a trail about 20 minutes from our work site that I'd been meaning to check out. Nothing special, just a quiet track that wound through some scrubland and into denser bush. Being a plasterer means I spend most of my time indoors under artificial light, so any chance to get some fresh air is welcome. I parked my Ford Fairlane at a small clearing that served as a makeshift car park. There was no one else around, which wasn't surprising for a Friday afternoon. Most people would be finishing up work and heading to the pub, not wandering in the bush. I remember checking my watch. It was around 4:30, giving me a good hour and a half of daylight. Plenty of time for a walk, I thought. The track started off wide enough, well-trodden and easy to follow. The first kilometer or so was pleasant, with the late afternoon sun filtering through the eucalyptus trees. I could hear kookaburras in the distance, and the occasional rustle as a lizard darted across the path. Normal bush sounds. Peaceful. About 20 minutes in, the track narrowed and began to climb slightly. The vegetation grew denser, with more undergrowth and fallen logs. Nothing I couldn't handle, though. I'd been on plenty of bushwalks before, some much more challenging than this. I remember pausing to take a drink from my water bottle and noticing how quiet it had become. No bird calls, no insect sounds, just the whisper of wind through the leaves. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Sometimes the bush goes quiet, but looking back, that should have been my first warning. I continued on, and the path began to descend into a shallow gully. The trees were taller here, older, and the sunlight struggled to penetrate the canopy. It was noticeably cooler, and I zipped up my jacket. As I moved deeper into the gully, I became aware of an odd smell. Not the usual bush smells of eucalyptus and soil, but something musky, like wet dog, but stronger, more pungent. I remember wrinkling my nose and wondering if there was a dead animal nearby. Then I heard the first sound. It wasn't immediately alarming, just a crack, like a branch breaking underfoot. Any bushwalker knows that sound. Could be a kangaroo, a wombat, even another person. I stopped and looked around, but couldn't see anything through the dense undergrowth. I called out a hello, thinking it might be another walker, but there was no response. I continued on, but now I was more alert, more aware of my surroundings. The gully had narrowed and the path was less defined. I found myself having to push through sections of undergrowth. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows, and I was considering turning back. That's when I heard it again. A crack, louder this time and definitely closer. And it wasn't just one sound, it was a series of them, heavy footfalls moving through the bush. Whatever it was big, too big to be a wallaby or a roo. I stopped again, my heart rate picking up. "Hello," I called, louder this time. "Anyone there?" The sounds stopped. Complete silence fell, that eerie bush silence that seems to press against your eardrums. I stood still, straining to hear, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. For a few moments, nothing. Then, a low, rumbling sound that wasn't quite a growl, but wasn't any animal call I recognized. It seemed to come from somewhere to my left, maybe 30 meters away. I turned slowly in that direction, squinting through the trees. Nothing, just shadows and foliage. I'm not ashamed to admit that fear gripped me then. I'd been in the bush enough times to know when something wasn't right. Whatever was out there wasn't normal wildlife. It was too big, too deliberate in its movements. I decided to head back. No point pushing on when my instincts were screaming at me to leave. I turned around, trying to move casually, as if I'd just decided it was time to go back, not because I was terrified. I'd only taken a few steps when I heard it again, the footfalls, following me. I quickened my pace, my boots crunching on the leaf litter. The footfalls behind me quickened too. Heavy, deliberate steps. Crack, crunch, snap. Louder than they should be, and this thought came to me then and has stayed with me since, like an elephant running around in galoshes. That's the only way I can describe it. Too loud, too heavy for a human or any native Australian animal. I was walking fast now, not quite running, but close to it. The path was uphill and my breath was coming in short gasps, not just from exertion but from fear, pure, primal fear. The sounds behind me were getting closer. Whatever it was gaining on me. I glanced over my shoulder but could see nothing but trees and shadows. The sun was lower now, the light fading faster than I'd expected. That's when I heard the grunt. A deep, throaty sound that froze my blood. It was close, too close, maybe 20 meters behind me. I ran. I abandoned any pretense of calm and just ran, crashing through the undergrowth, branches whipping at my face and arms. The path was barely visible, but I knew the general direction back to the car park. My lungs burned and my legs felt like rubber, but terror drove me on. The thing behind me was running too. I could hear it smashing through the bush, not bothering with stealth anymore. The sound was deafening, branches snapping like gunshots, the ground trembling with each footfall. And it was fast, much faster than I would have thought possible for something so large. I burst out of the denser bush onto the wider section of the path, the part closer to the car park. I could see my Fairlane in the distance, its dark blue paint catching the last of the sunlight. Maybe 200 meters away. I pumped my arms and legs harder, ignoring the stitch in my side and the roar burning in my throat. The sounds behind me hadn't stopped. If anything, they were closer. I could hear breathing now, heavy, rasping breaths, and that smell, that musky animal smell, was stronger. It was right behind me. I fumbled in my pocket for my car keys as I ran, nearly dropping them in my panic. The car was closer now, maybe 50 meters away. I thumbed the key, ready to jam it into the lock the second I reached the door. 30 meters, 20, 10. I slammed into the driver's side door, the metal cool against my sweating palms. I jammed the key into the lock, twisted and yanked the door open, throwing myself inside. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. That's when I felt it. The car rocked violently, and there was a sound. A solid thump as something hit the rear. The entire Fairlane, a solid 1.5 tons of Australian steel, shuddered as if it had been struck by another vehicle. I twisted around in my seat and looked out the rear window. I'll never forget what I saw in that moment. A massive, broad chest covered in dark fur or hair. 2 enormous arms, the hands, if you could call them that, gripping the back of my car. And the skin. It was dark, almost black, but not like a human's. More like the skin of an ape, but rougher, tougher looking. I didn't see its face. Thank God I didn't see its face. Just that chest, those arms, those hands gripping my car with impossible strength. I screamed. I'm not embarrassed to admit it. I screamed like a child and turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and without thinking, I slammed the gear shift into reverse and floored the accelerator. The car shot backwards. There was a thud, a horrible, meaty sound, and the rear of the car rose up as if we'd hit a speed bump, then crashed back down. The grip on the car released, and I heard a sound, part grunt, part roar, of pain or surprise or rage, I don't know. I didn't wait to find out. I jammed the car into first gear and took off, the tires spinning on the dirt before catching. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I just drove, hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I drove straight home, not stopping once. My flat was in a small complex in a Melbourne suburb, and I've never been so glad to see those familiar brick walls. I parked haphazardly, not caring that I was taking up 2 spaces, and ran inside, locking the door behind me. I spent that night sitting in my living room with every light on, jumping at every sound. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those massive black arms, felt the car shaking as whatever it was grabbed hold. The next morning, I called Bom. He could tell something was wrong from my voice, and he came right over. I told him everything, expecting disbelief, maybe even ridicule. But Bom listened silently, his weathered face serious. When I'd finished, he sipped his tea and said, "We should check the back of your car." We went outside. In the harsh daylight, with people going about their normal Saturday business around us, the events of the previous evening seemed almost unreal. Almost. Until we saw the rear of my Fairlane. There were dents in the trunk. Large, deep impressions that couldn't have been made by a falling branch or another vehicle. They almost looked like handprints. Massive handprints, with the metal crushed inward as if gripped by something with incredible strength. Bom ran his fingers over the dents, his expression grim. "I reckon we should go back," he said finally. I stared at him, thinking he'd lost his mind. "Go back? Are you serious?" "Not to find it," he clarified quickly, "but to look for tracks, evidence. You're a professional plasterer, mate. So am I. If there are footprints, we can make casts of them." I didn't want to go back. Every fiber of my being rebelled at the idea, but Bom was right. If we found tracks, we'd have proof. And part of me needed that proof, needed to know I hadn't imagined the whole thing. So we went. Not to the same spot. I refused to walk that path again, but to the construction site where we'd been working. It was isolated, at the edge of the same stretch of bush. And if something large was moving through the area, it might have passed by there. The site was deserted on Saturday. We parked and began searching the ground around the perimeter where the cleared land met the bush. Bom took one side, I took the other. I'd almost given up when Bom called out. I hurried over to where he was crouching, staring at the ground with an expression of disbelief. There in the soft dirt were footprints, but not human footprints, not as we knew them. They were huge, measuring about 21 centimeters by 16 centimeters. and they were oddly shaped, much wider than a normal human foot, with what looked like 5 toes, but splayed out in a way that no humans would be. Bom looked up at me, his face pale. "These aren't human," he said simply. "And they're fresh," I added, noting how clear the impressions were. "From last night or early this morning." Without another word, we got our plastering equipment from the car. As professionals, we knew exactly how to create perfect casts. We mixed the plaster right there, carefully pouring it into the clearest prints, working methodically despite our shaking hands. The plaster took about 30 minutes to set enough for us to carefully remove the casts. We made 3 in total, from 3 different footprints, each one identical, each one impossible. As we drove away from the site, the plaster casts wrapped carefully in old towels in the back of Bom's ute. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something massive emerge from the tree line. But there was nothing. Just the bush, silent and inscrutable. I've still got those casts. They're in a box in my garage, wrapped in the same towels. Sometimes when I can't sleep, I take them out and look at them, running my fingers over the impossible shapes. I never went bushwalking alone again. In fact, I left Victoria altogether a few months later, moving to Queensland for better job opportunities, as I told my friends and family. But the truth is, I couldn't stand to be near those woods anymore. I don't know what was in the bush that day, I don't want to know. But sometimes, when the wind is right and I catch a certain musky smell, or when I hear an unusually heavy footfall outside my window at night, I remember those massive black arms gripping my car, and I lie awake until dawn, listening. Story 13. I've never told many people about this. Even after 40+ years, I still get goosebumps thinking about it. It was winter in Australia, July of 1979, and I was 8 years old. My dad worked as a grader driver back then, maintaining those long stretches of dirt roads that connect the remote parts of New South Wales. We'd often travel with him during school holidays, staying in makeshift campsites as he moved from job to job. Mum was Aboriginal, from one of the local tribes around Katoomba, and she loved these trips. She'd say it was good for me to learn about the bush, to feel the earth beneath my feet instead of just concrete and asphalt. Dad was white, a practical man who spent his days behind the controls of his massive yellow grader, scraping and leveling the red dirt roads that snaked through the countryside. We were camping west of town. I can't remember exactly which one now. I just remember the thick eucalyptus forest around us, the smell of campfire smoke, and the eerie silence that would sometimes fall over the bush when even the birds stopped calling. That morning had started like any other. Dad had left before sunrise to start his work. Mum was busy setting up our little camp, hanging washing between trees and organizing our supplies. I was bored. 8-year-olds aren't great at sitting around, and I'd already explored the immediate area around our tent dozens of times. I'd caught yabbies in the creek nearby, collected interesting rocks and sticks, and climbed every climbable tree within sight of our camp. "Mum, I'm going to look for some cool rocks," I called out, already starting to wander toward a patch of bushland that seemed interesting. "Don't go far, Johnny," she replied, not looking up from the pot she was scrubbing. "Stay where you can still see the smoke from our fire." I nodded, though she couldn't see me, and kept walking. I wasn't planning to go far, just far enough to feel like I was on an adventure. The morning air was crisp, and my breath came out in little puffs of steam. The forest was quiet except for the occasional call of a kookaburra or the rustle of something small moving through the underbrush. About 30 meters from camp, not far at all really, I found a little clearing where blackberry bushes grew in a tangled mass. They were covered in berries, some still red, others ripened to a deep purple-black. I started picking the ripe ones, popping them into my mouth, the sweet juice staining my fingers. I was completely absorbed in this simple pleasure when I heard something, a sound like heavy breathing, then the snap of a twig, I turned slowly, a handful of berries halfway to my mouth. That's when I saw it. At first, my brain tried to make sense of what I was seeing by turning it into something familiar. A man in a coat? A bear? We didn't have bears in Australia, but I'd seen them in picture books and on TV shows. It was hunched over on the other side of the blackberry patch, about 5 or 6 meters away from me. Its massive hand, because it definitely had hands, not paws, was pulling berries from the bush and bringing them to its mouth with surprisingly delicate movements. I froze completely. I don't think I was even breathing. It must have sensed me watching because it suddenly stopped eating and slowly straightened up. That's when I realized how tall it was. Easily 2 meters, maybe more. Its entire body was covered in thick, shaggy hair, a reddish-brown color like rust or old blood. Not fur exactly, more like human hair, but wilder, covering everything except parts of its face. And its face, God, I'll never forget that face. It was flat and broad, almost like it had been pressed in. Deep-set eyes peered out from under a heavy brow ridge, and they were the most unsettling part. They weren't animal eyes. They were disturbingly human, with intelligence behind them. Those eyes locked onto mine, and I felt something pass between us. Recognition, maybe, like it knew me as much as I knew it. The creature and I stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only seconds. I watched as its massive chest expanded with a deep breath, saw the berries still clutched in its hand. I noticed things an 8-year-old shouldn't have to process. How its knuckles dragged against the ground when its arms hung loose, how its shoulders were impossibly broad, how its head seemed to sit directly on those shoulders with barely any neck. Then it made a sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a groan. More like a deep, rumbling sigh that seemed to come from its entire body. That broke the spell. I dropped the berries I was holding and ran. I don't remember my feet touching the ground. I just remember the pounding of my heart and the certainty that at any moment, massive hands would grab me from behind. I burst into our campsite, tears streaming down my face, gasping for breath. Mum was still by the fire, and she looked up in alarm as I threw myself into her arms. "There's a bear! I saw a bear!" I sobbed, burying my face against her shoulder. Mum held me tight, one hand stroking my hair to calm me down. When my breathing had steadied a bit, she gently pulled back to look at my face. "Tell me what you saw, Johnny," she said quietly. Between hiccuping sobs, I described it. The height, the reddish-brown hair, the flat face, those eyes. I kept calling it a bear because that was the closest thing my young mind could compare it to. Mum didn't laugh or dismiss me like I half expected. Instead, her face grew serious, and I saw something flash across her features. Recognition. "That's not a bear, Johnny," she said softly. "We don't have bears in Australia, remember? What you saw was a hairy man." "A what?" I asked, wiping my nose on my sleeve. "A hairy man. My people have known about them for thousands of years. They live deep in the bush, away from humans mostly. They're special beings, very old, very wise. Not many people see them." I stared at her, trying to understand. "But it was scary, Mum." She nodded slowly. "They can be scary, yes. They're wild and powerful. But they're not evil, Johnny. They're just different. They belong to this land just like we do." The matter-of-fact way she spoke about it confused me more than if she'd told me I'd imagined it. She talked about this hairy man like it was just another animal in the bush, like a kangaroo or a wombat, something everyone knew existed. "Have you seen one?" I asked. She hesitated, then nodded once. "When I was about your age, my grandmother explained them to me, just like I'm explaining to you now. Does Dad know about them?" A small smile touched her lips. "Your dad is a practical man. He believes in what he can see and touch and fix with his tools. I've told him the stories, but..." She shrugged. "Some people need to see with their own eyes." I thought about telling Dad when he came back that evening, but decided against it. Even at 8, I understood that my father lived in a different world than my mother in some ways. A world of engines and metal and things that could be explained by science. The creature I'd seen didn't seem to belong in that world. For the rest of the day, I stayed close to camp. Mum went about her business as usual, but I noticed she kept glancing toward the trees where I'd seen the creature. Once, I caught her placing a small offering, a handful of our dried fruits and nuts, at the edge of our campsite. When she saw me watching, she simply said, "It's good to show respect." That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of branches, every rustle of leaves had me sitting bolt upright in our tent. Dad snored softly beside me, oblivious, while Mum seemed to be sleeping peacefully on my other side. But then I noticed her eyes were open, staring at the tent ceiling. "Is it going to come here?" I whispered. She turned to look at me. "No, Johnny. They don't like our noise, our smells. They stay away from camps. But I saw it so close. You were quiet, alone. You surprised each other." She reached out to smooth my hair. "Try to sleep now." "I'm scared," I admitted. "I know." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Would you feel better if I told you a story about them? The stories my grandmother told me?" I nodded eagerly, and she began to speak in a low voice, telling me how the hairy men had been here since the dream time, how they knew the secrets of the bush, how they sometimes helped lost children find their way home. The stories were both comforting and unsettling. They painted these creatures as powerful and mysterious, but not malevolent. I must have fallen asleep eventually, because the next thing I remember is waking to the sounds of Dad packing up his gear to head out for another day's work. The morning light filtering through the tent canvas made the previous day's encounter seem almost like a dream. But it wasn't a dream. I know that now, all these years later. What I saw was real. As we were packing up camp later that morning, I wandered back toward the blackberry bushes, staying just close enough that I could still see our camp clearly. I don't know what I expected to find. Footprints maybe, or some sign that would prove to myself that it had really happened. What I found instead sent a chill down my spine. The blackberry bush I'd been picking from was completely stripped of berries on the side where the creature had been standing. Not just a few berries missing, every single one gone, even the unripe ones. And on the ground nearby was a strange arrangement of sticks, 3 long ones laid out in a triangle, with smaller sticks placed inside it. It looked deliberately placed, not something that would happen naturally. I ran back to camp and tugged at Mum's sleeve, trying to get her to come see. But Dad was calling that it was time to go, and she was busy loading the last of our things into the car. She promised we'd come back another time, but we never did, at least not to that exact spot. Over the years that followed, I peppered my mother with questions about the hairy men. Some she answered, others she deflected with a smile and a shake of her head. "Some things you're not meant to know everything about, Johnny," she would say. I learned that they were known by different names in different Aboriginal languages, Yowie, Doolagal, Jugabina. I learned that many Aboriginal people across Australia had similar stories of these creatures, despite tribes being separated by vast distances and having no contact with each other for thousands of years. As I grew older, I read what little documented information existed about these beings. Most accounts were dismissed as myth or misidentification of known animals. Scientists scoffed at the idea, but I knew what I'd seen. Dad passed away when I was in my 20s, never knowing about my encounter. Mum followed a few years later. Before she died, I asked her one last time about the hairy man I'd seen. Was it real, Mum? Really real? Not just a story to explain something else? She'd looked at me with those wise eyes of hers and said simply, "You saw it, didn't you?" I visit the bush often now, sometimes for work, sometimes just to reconnect with the land. I've never seen another hairy man, though sometimes in the deepest parts of the forest, I get the prickling sensation of being watched. Sometimes I find arrangements of sticks that seem too deliberate to be random, or fruit trees stripped bare on just one side. I've never told my own kids about what I saw. I'm not sure why. Maybe I'm waiting for them to come to me with their own story first. Or maybe some experiences are so profound, so outside our everyday understanding, that they're hard to put into words without sounding crazy. But I know what I saw that winter morning in 1979. I saw something that existed in the space between worlds, the modern Australian world I was growing up in, and the ancient world of my mother's ancestors. Something that reminded me that for all our roads and cities and certainties, there are still mysteries in this land that run deeper than we can imagine. And sometimes, if you're quiet enough and alone in the bush, those mysteries reveal themselves to you just for a moment before disappearing back into the shadows of the eucalyptus trees. Story 14. I've never told this story to anyone outside the station, not because I didn't think people would believe me, but because even now, 40-something years later, I still wake up in cold sweats thinking about it, about how the dog just died, just like that, from fear alone. It was 1979, and I was working as a jackaroo at Ardmore Station in Queensland. I was 22 at the time, fresh out of Brisbane, and eager to prove myself in the outback. My parents thought I was mad, trading city comforts for dust and flies, but I was determined to make it as a proper stockman. Ardmore was massive, thousands of acres of scrubland, gum trees and red dirt stretching as far as you could see. The isolation was something else. No phones, no telly, just a two-way radio for emergencies. The nearest town was about 3 hours away by ute on roads that would rattle your teeth loose. That particular evening, I remember it was sometime in August, we'd finished mustering cattle from the eastern paddocks. Brutal work in the heat, even though it was winter. We were all exhausted, covered in dust that had worked its way into every crease and fold of our bodies. There were about 12 of us sitting around on our swags, waiting for old Charlie to finish cooking dinner. Charlie was our cook, an ancient bloke who'd been working outback stations since before the war. He lived in this beat-up caravan that followed us around the property. Charlie had this border collie, Jess was her name, a clever little thing that was always underfoot. She was tied up underneath the caravan that evening, probably to keep her from pinching our dinner. The sun was just starting to set, painting everything this deep orange red. We were passing around a few tinnies, yarning about the day, nothing special. I remember exactly what I was doing when it happened. I was rolling a smoke, concentrating on not spilling the tobacco in the fading light. The air was cooling down fast, like it does in the outback, scorching hot in the day, freezing at night. There were those typical evening sounds, kookaburras going mad in the trees, someone clanging pots around the fire, blokes laughing. Then Jess started barking. Now, working dogs bark all the time, right? But this wasn't normal barking. This was... Christ, I don't know how to describe it properly. It was frantic, high-pitched, desperate. The kind of sound that makes the hair on your neck stand up. The kind of sound that's hardwired into humans to recognize as danger. Everyone stopped what they were doing. The silence among us was immediate. You know how sometimes you just sense something's wrong? That primitive instinct. That's what hit us all at once. Someone said, "What's got into Jess?" And we all looked over toward Charlie's caravan. That's when I saw it. About 15 meters away, standing right in front of the caravan, right in front of Jess, was something I couldn't immediately identify. From our angle, we could see its back. It wasn't moving, just standing there, stock still. Jess was going absolutely mental, lunging at the end of her chain, making this awful noise that didn't even sound canine anymore. I remember thinking she was going to choke herself. Then, in an instant, the barking just stopped. Dead silence, no warning, no whimper, nothing, just silence. In that moment of quiet, the thing, whatever it was, turned slightly and loped away into the scrub. Not running exactly, but moving quickly with this strange gait, like it was hunched over. I caught a side profile of it as it moved. Brown, covered in hair that was longer than a bear's but not shaggy. About 5 feet tall if it had stood upright, though it was moving in a kind of crouched position. It wasn't skinny, but it wasn't bulky like a gorilla either. Just solid, muscular, and moving with purpose. We were all frozen. I think I'd stopped breathing. It felt like minutes passed, but it must have been seconds. Then Mick, one of the Aboriginal stockmen, broke the spell by saying something urgent in language to his cousin Jimmy. They both got up fast. Charlie rushed to his caravan shouting for Jess. I snapped out of it and followed him. What I saw next is something I'll never forget. Jess was lying there, still chained up, completely still. Her eyes were open, staring at nothing. No wounds, no blood, nothing physically wrong with her that we could see, but she was dead. Stone dead. Charlie dropped to his knees beside her, checking for breathing, feeling for a heartbeat. Nothing. He looked up at us, his weathered face completely white. What the bloody hell just happened? Nobody answered. Nobody knew what to say. Then Mick spoke up. Junjari. The word hung in the air. Most of us younger blokes and the white stockmen looked confused, but the older Aboriginal workers were nodding grimly. What's a Junjari? I finally asked. Mick looked at me with the most serious expression I'd ever seen on him. Bad spirit. Bad business. Two kinds, big ones and little ones. That was little one. They eat meat. What, like a bunyip? Asked Trevor, another jackaroo. Jimmy shook his head. Not story, real. They stay hidden. Don't like people. Don't show themselves. Well, this bloody one did, Charlie said, his voice cracking as he stroked Jess's fur. I couldn't get my head around what had happened. But how did she die? It didn't touch her, did it? Mick and Jimmy exchanged glances. Fear, Jimmy said simply. Junjari, look at you. You die from fear. Dog saw its face. I felt sick. I'd always been skeptical about the stories you hear in the outback. Drop bears and yowies and all that. Tourist nonsense, I thought. But I'd just seen something with my own eyes that I couldn't explain. By now, several of the men had grabbed torches and rifles. Mick had a shotgun, and he was whispering something to Jimmy. I picked up my swag knife. Pathetic protection, I realize now, but I wasn't thinking straight. We need to track it, said the head stockman, a bloke called Brennan. Make sure it's gone. Nobody wanted to go out there in the dark after that thing. But nobody wanted to stay in camp not knowing where it was either. So 8 of us set out with torches, following the direction we'd seen it go. I was shaking so badly I could barely hold my torch steady. The beam bounced off gum trees and scrub, creating moving shadows that made me flinch every few seconds. We found tracks almost immediately. Not human, not animal, at least not any animal I recognized. They looked a bit like a human handprint, but with longer fingers. Like something that walked on all fours, but with hands, not paws. Mick and Jimmy led the way, their eyes reading the ground, in a way us white blokes couldn't. We followed those tracks for about 200 meters, the beams of our torches crossing and recrossing the hard-packed earth, and then the tracks just stopped. Not gradually, not fading away. They just ended, as if the creature had vanished into thin air. One clear print, then nothing but undisturbed earth. Where'd it go? I whispered. Mick pointed up at the trees, then across at the rocky outcrop about 50 meters away. Could climb, could jump. Junjari moved different to people. We spread out, searching the area for another 20 minutes. Nothing. Not a single track, not a broken branch. Nothing. Finally, Brennan called it quits. Back to camp. Stay together. Keep your eyes open. No one argued. We hurried back, walking much faster than we had on the way out. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves made us all tense up. When we got back, the mood in camp had changed completely. The easy camaraderie was gone. Everyone was on edge. Charlie had wrapped Jess in a blanket and placed her in the back of his ute. He wasn't talking to anybody. No one slept well that night. We kept the fire blazing high, much bigger than we normally would. Every man had something near him, a rifle, a knife, an axe. Even the blokes who usually slept in swags under the stars moved into the bunkhouse. I remember lying there, just staring at the ceiling, listening to every sound outside. The next morning, I half expected everything to seem different in the daylight, less frightening somehow. But if anything, it was worse. We could see Jess's body clearly now. There wasn't a mark on her. The vet who came out 3 days later was baffled. Heart failure, he said. But healthy dogs in their prime don't just have heart failure for no reason. We searched again in the daylight. The tracks were still there, exactly as we'd found them the night before, ending abruptly in the middle of nowhere. We looked for signs of the creature having climbed a tree or jumped onto rocks, but there was nothing. For weeks afterward, the Aboriginal workers refused to go out alone, especially near dusk. They hung these little bundles of gum leaves and something else, I never found out what, around the camp. Protection, they said. I stayed at Ardmore for another 8 months after that incident. Never saw the Junjari again, but I felt it. We all did. That sense of being watched whenever we were out in the scrub. The feeling of something just beyond your vision. I'd catch myself scanning the trees, looking for movement. One night, about 2 months after it happened, I finally got up the courage to ask old Bill, one of the Aboriginal elders who sometimes came to the station, more about the Junjari. They've been here forever, he told me, his voice low even though we were alone by the fire. Before people, they keep to themselves mostly. What do they want? I asked. Bill stared into the fire for a long time before answering. Land is theirs. They watch. They know when you don't respect it. Dog probably made it angry. Have you ever seen one? I asked. Bill nodded slowly. Once, when I was a boy, smaller than the one you saw. What happened? My grandfather made me close my eyes, said never look at their face. The fear will kill you. I shivered, remembering poor Jess. Why did it show itself to us? Jimmy said they stay hidden. Bill's expression was grave. Bad sign when Junjari shows itself. Means something changing, land changing. Maybe you boys were in wrong place. Maybe you did something wrong without knowing. I thought about this for days afterward. Had we disturbed something? Crossed some boundary we didn't know about? It was impossible to say. I left Ardmore the following April. Couldn't handle the isolation anymore, or maybe I just couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I worked a few other stations after that, but never stayed long. Eventually went back to Brisbane, got a job in construction, normal life, but I've never forgotten what I saw. That brown, hairy figure standing motionless in front of a terrified dog. The way it moved when it left, not quite human, not quite animal. The tracks that ended nowhere. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all. If we all shared some kind of mass hallucination brought on by heat and exhaustion. But then I remember Jess, dead without a mark on her. And I know what I saw. I've read about yoes and other creatures people claim to have seen in the outback. Some descriptions sound similar, but nothing quite matches what we saw that evening on Ardmore Station. Nothing explains how a healthy dog could die of fright or how tracks could simply vanish. All I know is that there are things out there in the vast emptiness of the Australian outback that don't fit into our understanding of the world. Things the original inhabitants have known about for thousands of years that we dismiss as myths and legends. I don't talk about it much. Who'd believe me? But every August, when the light starts to change and the evenings get that particular quality, not quite day, not quite night, I remember. And I find myself looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees, listening for sounds that don't belong. Because once you've seen a Junjari, you never stop looking for them. And worse, you never shake the feeling that they're looking for you. Story 15. It's still difficult for me to talk about what happened that day in September 1979. I've shared this with very few people, mostly because I'm afraid they'll think I'm crazy. but I need to get it out somewhere, and maybe someone here has experienced something similar. I was 13 years old, living in Queensland, Australia. My best mate Trevor and I spent most of our free time riding our bikes around Manila Avenue, which backed onto this massive pine forest. It wasn't anything fancy. I had this rusty Malvern Star with worn brakes, but it was freedom on wheels to me. Behind Manila Avenue, there was this area that had been bulldozed for a highway they were planning to build. The construction crews had left these huge mounds of dirt that made perfect jumps for our bikes. We'd spend hours there after school, seeing who could get the most air. At the top of one hill stood this old abandoned house from the 50s, all weatherboard and peeling paint. We'd sneak in sometimes, daring each other to go into the darkest rooms. That particular day, I remember it was a Wednesday because we had double maths, which I hated. We finished school and headed straight to our usual spot. The September heat was brutal, and I remember my school shirt was sticking to my back with sweat. Trevor suggested we try this new path that had been freshly bulldozed through the pine forest. We'd never gone that far in before, but we were bored with our usual jumps. "Bet you can't keep up," Trevor called over his shoulder as he pedaled ahead. The path was wide enough for a vehicle, but rough with loose gravel and exposed tree roots that made the handlebars vibrate in my grip. The pine trees towered on either side, blocking out most of the late afternoon sun. I remember thinking how quiet it was once we got deeper in. No birds, no insects buzzing, just the crunch of our tires on the dirt. We'd been riding for about a minute when it hit me. This smell. God, I'll never forget that smell. It was like roadkill that had been baking in the sun for days, mixed with something else I couldn't place. Something musky and almost chemical. It was so strong I could taste it. My lungs felt coated with it. I actually had to stop pedaling because my stomach heaved and I thought I was going to spew right there. "Trev, you smell that?" I called out, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. When he didn't answer, I looked up. Trevor had stopped about 10 meters ahead of me. He was just sitting there on his bike, completely still. As I rolled up beside him, I saw his face. He was staring straight ahead, his mouth hanging open. His skin had gone this weird grayish color. That's when I heard it. I want to be clear. I've heard plenty of sounds in my life. I've heard dingoes howling, the screech of car brakes before a crash, even my nan's terrible opera singing. Nothing, absolutely nothing, has ever come close to what I heard that day. It started as this deep, guttural sound that seemed to come from the ground itself. Then it rose into this high-pitched scream that made my eardrums feel like they were going to burst. It wasn't animal. It wasn't human. It was something else. I felt it vibrating through my ribcage, like when you stand too close to massive speakers at a concert. I followed Trevor's gaze, and that's when I saw it. About 30 meters ahead to our left, partially hidden behind one of the larger pine trees, was something. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing at first. It was massive. I'm talking easily 8 feet tall. Its body was enormous, maybe 4 feet wide, with a build that made the biggest rugby players look like children. I remember thinking it must have weighed at least 250 kilos, probably more. The thing's skin or fur, I couldn't tell which, was this dark red color, like dried blood, or maybe a dirty dark brown. It was hard to be sure in the dappled light of the forest. What I could see clearly were its arms. They hung wrong, too long for its body, especially from the elbows down to these massive hands. But its head, Christ, its head. It looked too small for such a massive body, and it seemed to sit directly on those hulking shoulders. I don't remember seeing a neck at all. And its eyes, they caught what little sunlight filtered through the trees and reflected back this dull red glow that made my blood turn to ice. We must have been downwind from it because it hadn't noticed us immediately. But as we sat there, frozen on our bikes, it turned those red eyes directly at us. I felt seen in a way I've never experienced before or since. like it wasn't just looking at me, but into me, through me. Then it did something that still haunts my nightmares. It raised those impossibly long arms above its head, gripped a pine tree, a fully grown pine that must have been 40 feet tall, and began to shake it. Not just a gentle shake. This thing was whipping this massive tree back and forth like it was no more than a sapling. The whole forest seemed to vibrate with the force of it. Pine needles and bark showered down. The sound of wood creaking and straining mixed with that ungodly scream. I don't know how long we stared, probably only seconds, but it felt like hours. Trevor was the first to break free from the paralysis. "Go, go, go!" he shouted, his voice cracking with terror. I don't remember consciously deciding to move. One moment I was frozen, the next I was pedaling harder than I ever had in my life. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air that still tasted of that vile stench. I could hear Trevor's ragged breathing beside me as we flew back down the path. I didn't look back, I couldn't. Some primal part of my brain told me that if I turned around, if I saw that thing coming after us, my heart would simply stop in my chest. We didn't stop pedaling until we hit Manila Avenue. My bike chain was slipping from how hard I was pushing, and the brakes squealed in protest when I finally skidded to a halt. Trevor practically fell off his bike beside me. We both doubled over, gasping for breath, neither of us able to speak for what felt like ages. What? What the hell was that? Trevor finally managed to wheeze out. "I don't know," was all I could say. What else could I say? Nothing in my 13 years of existence had prepared me for whatever we'd just seen. We made a pact right there on the spot, with the late afternoon sun setting behind us and our legs still shaking so bad we could barely stand. We would never go back to that part of the forest. Never. And we would never tell anyone what we saw. Who would believe us? They'd think we were making it up, or worse, that we were losing our minds. I broke that second part of the pact only once, telling my dad that night when the nightmares wouldn't let me sleep. He sat on the edge of my bed, listened without interrupting, then patted my shoulder and told me it was probably just a feral pig or a large kangaroo distorted by shadows and our overactive imaginations. He didn't believe me. I could see it in his eyes, that look adults give kids when they're humoring them. The nightmares continued for 4 straight nights. Always the same, running through an endless pine forest while that screaming followed me, getting closer and closer until I woke up soaked in sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs. Trevor and I kept our word about not returning to that part of the forest. We found new places to ride our bikes, new jumps to conquer. We never spoke about what we saw again, not even between ourselves, like if we didn't acknowledge it, maybe it would somehow become less real. But sometimes, when the wind is right, I swear I can still smell that stench. And in the years since, I've developed this irrational fear of forests, the way the trees move in the wind, the darkness between trunks that could hide anything, anyone. I've done research since then. There are stories from Aboriginal people about hairy men in the bush, creatures that exist somewhere between our world and the dream time. I've read about similar encounters across Australia, in Gippsland, the Blue Mountains, the forests of Tasmania. Most people talk about these creatures as being black or dark grey, but what Trevor and I saw was definitely that reddish-brown colour. Maybe it was a different species, or maybe it was covered in the red earth from the construction site. I don't know. What I do know is that I saw something that day that shouldn't exist, something that defies explanation. I'm 47 now, with kids of my own, but I've never told them this story. I let them play in the bush behind our house, but I always keep an eye on the tree line. Always. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, there are days when I almost convinced myself it was just a teenage hallucination brought on by heat and an overactive imagination. But then I'll hear a branch snap outside at night or catch a whiff of something musky on the wind, and I'm 13 again, frozen on my bike, staring into those red eyes. The highway eventually got built where we used to ride. They cleared most of that forest, cut down all those pine trees. I wonder sometimes if they found anything strange during the construction. Unexplained footprints, areas where animals wouldn't go. I wonder if whatever we saw that day is still out there somewhere, deeper in the remaining forest, watching and waiting. I've never gone back to check. Some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed again. Some knowledge can't be unlearned, and some creatures should remain unseen. The old house on the hill is gone now too, replaced by a shopping center. Manila Avenue has new families, kids with newer, fancier bikes than we ever had. I drove past there a few years back just to see how it had changed. The place looks completely different now, unrecognizable from my childhood memories. But as I sat at the traffic light, staring at where the forest edge used to be, I swear I felt something watching me from the few remaining trees. A pressure in the air, a heaviness that made it hard to breathe. The light turned green, and I drove away as fast as I could, the hairs on the back of my neck standing straight up. Whatever walks in those Queensland forests isn't human. It isn't animal either, not in any way we understand. It's something else entirely, something ancient and powerful. And it's still there. I feel it in my bones. It's still there, moving between the trees, watching and waiting. I still don't know what it was. I probably never will, but I know it saw me. It saw Trevor. And in that moment when our eyes met, it recognized us as surely as we recognized that it was something beyond our understanding. That's the part that still keeps me up at night all these years later. Not just that such things exist in our world, hiding in the shadows of forests and the corners of our understanding, but that it saw me, and it knows.